Hey friend, welcome back. Or maybe this is your very first time here. Either way, I'm genuinely glad you found your way to this moment. So before we go any further, if something about this video speaks to you tonight, if the story feels worth carrying with you into your dreams, just hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and maybe leave a comment below telling me where you are right now. Curled up in bed, on the couch with the lights already dim. I love knowing that. It makes this feel less like a broadcast, and more like a conversation between friends. Now dim the lights, find a comfortable position, maybe put on a gentle fan in the background, because tonight we're going somewhere you've never quite been before. Here's something I need you to sit with for just a moment. Imagine that you wake up not by choice, not to an alarm you set yourself, but because a bell rings. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, the room is freezing cold, there is no light, and that bell does not ask how you feel. It does not care that you are exhausted. It simply rings, and your body knows deep in your bones that you have no choice but to rise. Now imagine that this happens every single day for the rest of your life. And here is the part that makes this truly extraordinary. That bell doesn't just own you. For nearly 1,000 years it owned everyone, farmers in the fields, merchants in the marketplace, kings in their castles. An entire civilization synchronized its heartbeat to the sound of one small bell swinging in the tower of a medieval monastery. Tonight we're going inside those walls, and I promise you, nothing is quite what you imagine. Let's start at the very beginning of this story. Not the dramatic beginning, but the quiet one. The one that almost no one talks about. Picture a young man, wealthy family, good prospects, the kind of future that most people in the ancient world would have killed for. His name is Benedict. He's living in Rome around the year 500, and by every measure his life should be comfortable. Rome, the eternal city, is still standing, still functioning, still the centre of the known world, and yet something about it makes Benedict deeply uneasy. The corruption, the noise, the endless hunger for more. He looks at the city around him and decides to do something that frankly sounds a little extreme. He walks away from all of it. He goes into the wilderness. He lives alone in a cave near a place called Subiaco, about 40 miles east of Rome. He stays there for 3 years. 3 years of silence, cold hunger and prayer. And in those years something crystallizes inside him, an idea so simple and so radical that it would reshape Western civilization for the next 15 centuries. The idea was this, that a life lived in rhythm, in deliberate, structured, sacred rhythm, was the closest thing to heaven a human being could experience on earth. In the year 529, Benedict founded a monastery at Monte Cassino, in the mountains of southern Italy. And he wrote down his rules. Not many rules, his famous document is barely 73 short chapters. But every single line of it was designed to answer one question: what should we do, and when should we do it? The answer, it turned out, revolved almost entirely around the bell. Here's what a day inside a medieval monastery actually looked like, and I want you to feel this, not just hear it. The bell rings for the first time at roughly 2 o'clock in the morning. This service is called vigils, though it would later become known as matins. Every monk, no matter how tired, no matter how ill, rises from his wooden bed in the dark dormitory and makes his way silently to the church. There by candlelight they chant psalms together. The sound is low and ancient, and honestly, if you heard it today it would probably give you chills. Then back to bed briefly, because the bell rings again at dawn for lauds, then again at 6 in the morning for prime, then terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, which, by the way, is where we get our modern word noon, though it originally referred to 3, not 12, vespers at sunset, and finally Compline at nightfall, closing the day in a whisper of prayer before darkness swallowed the monastery whole. 8 services, every single day, every single year, No weekends, no holidays, no sleeping in, and between those services work, study, silence. Meals eaten while someone reads aloud from scripture, because even dinner wasn't a time for idle conversation. Now here is where it gets fascinating, and this is the part I genuinely cannot get over. Before the mechanical clock was invented, which didn't happen until roughly the 13th century, these monastery bells were not just keeping time for the monks, they were keeping time for everyone. For the farmers who needed to know when to stop ploughing, for the merchants who needed to open their stalls, for the judges deciding how long a trial should last. Lewis Mumford, one of the great historians of technology, wrote that the monastery bell transformed time from something you experienced naturally into something you served. His exact phrase was haunting. He said that timekeeping had passed into time-serving, time accounting, and time rationing. Think about that. The modern obsession with schedules, deadlines, productivity, the feeling that time is always running out, all of it traces a direct line back to those bells. The Benedictine order at its height had 40,000 monasteries spread across Europe. 40,000. Every one of them ringing on its own schedule, but all of them operating by the same logic. Time is sacred, time must be measured, and the bell is the voice of God reminding you that not a single moment should be wasted. And here is perhaps the strangest twist of all: the monks needed to know when to ring the bell, which meant they needed tools to measure time. Sundials were useless on cloudy days, water clocks froze in winter, candles burned unevenly. So the urgent need to keep the monastery's sacred schedule is at least in part what drove medieval minds to eventually invent the mechanical clock. The monastery, in its obsession with sacred time, accidentally gave the modern world its most fundamental technology for measuring it. The bell tower was also the tallest structure in almost every medieval landscape. Travellers and pilgrims could see it from miles away. Not just as a spiritual landmark, but as a practical one. The sound of those bells could carry for miles on a clear morning, and the people who heard them built their entire lives around the rhythm it created. You woke when the bell told you to wake. You ate when it told you to eat. You stopped when it told you to stop. And when it rang for the last time at night, you closed your eyes in the dark and waited for it to begin again. But here is the question that lingers, the one that keeps this story from being just history, and turns it into something almost unbearably human. Why? Why would anyone choose this? Why would a person walk through those monastery gates, surrender their name, their freedom, their sleep, their silence, and offer all of it to a bell? The answer is more complicated and more surprising than you might think, because not everyone who ended up behind those walls chose to be there. Some of them never had a choice at all. And that is exactly where we go next, into one of the most unsettling, heartbreaking, and strangely beautiful chapters of monastic life. A practice so quietly accepted in the medieval world that it barely caused a ripple of controversy, and yet by modern standards it would stop you cold. Stay with me, we're only just beginning. Of all the questions I keep turning over in my mind whenever I think about this story, and trust me, I've thought about it a lot, the one that lingers the longest is this. What does it take for one person's ideas to survive for 15 centuries? Not just survive, not just be remembered the way you remember something dusty in a textbook, but actually run like software still actively operating in the background of an entire civilization, shaping the hours of millions of people's days long after the man who wrote it turned to dust. Because that is exactly what happened with Benedict of Nursia. And the remarkable thing, the thing that genuinely stops me cold every time I come back to it, is that he never set out to change the world. He set out to escape it. Let me paint you a picture of the world Benedict was born into. The year's around 480. The Western Roman Empire has officially collapsed just 4 years earlier. The city of Rome, the eternal city, the beating heart of the known world, for nearly 1,000 years, is still standing still inhabited, but it feels like a man who has survived a terrible accident. The bones are there, the grand marble buildings are still there, but something essential has gone out of it. Into this fractured world, Benedict is born in a small hilltop town called Nursia, northeast of Rome, the modern town of Norcia, in Umbria, Italy. He comes from a good family, Roman nobility, the kind of family that still believed in the old traditions, education, rhetoric, philosophy. And so, as was the custom for young men of his class, he is sent to Rome to study. He would have been somewhere around 14 or 15 years old when he arrived in the city, and what he found there disturbed him deeply. Rome by the late 5th century was not the Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. It was a city in moral freefall, at least that is how young Benedict experienced it. The students around him were wild. The teachers were more concerned with style and clever argument than with truth or virtue. Wealth was chaste. Pleasure was celebrated, and Benedict, standing in the middle of all of it, felt a growing horror that this life, this carefully arranged, comfortable, ambitious life his family had planned for him, was going to swallow him whole. So he did what very few people in history have had the nerve to actually do. He walked away. He went east out of Rome into the mountains, a place called Subiaco, a rugged, beautiful stretch of countryside about 40 miles from the city. And there, in a cave above a lake, not a metaphorical cave, not a humble cottage, but an actual cave carved into the rock, Benedict chose to live alone. 3 years. 3 years of silence, prayer, cold nights, and simple food, brought to him by a kind monk named Romanus who lived nearby. 3 years of stripping everything back until there was almost nothing left. Now, I want to be honest with you here because I think we sometimes romanticize this kind of story into something a little too clean. The truth is, those 3 years in the cave were probably not peaceful, they were probably brutal. Benedict himself, according to the earliest accounts written by Pope Gregory I, about 50 years after his death, was tormented by temptations during that time. Vivid, persistent, relentless temptations. At one point, the memory of a woman he had known in Rome became so overwhelming that he threw himself into a thorn bush to shock himself out of it. I know. That sounds absolutely extreme to modern ears, but here is the thing I find genuinely fascinating about that detail. It tells us something real about who Benedict was. He was not a man who floated serenely above human struggle. He was someone who fought hard, who understood weakness from the inside, who knew exactly what it felt like to want something you had decided you could not have. And that understanding, that deep first-hand knowledge of human frailty is precisely what made the document he would eventually write so remarkably wise. Word spread, as it tends to do about unusual people doing unusual things. Disciples began to find their way to the cave at Subiaco. Then more disciples, then more. Benedict established 12 small monasteries in that valley, 12 communities of men trying to live by a set of principles he was still working out in real time. And then the trouble started. A local priest named Florentius, moved according to the historical record by nothing more sophisticated than envy, decided that Benedict needed to be removed. First, he sent a poisoned loaf of bread as a gift. The story goes that a raven swept down and carried the bread away before it could be eaten. Make of that what you will. When that failed, Florentius tried a different approach. He sent a group of women to the monastery, apparently hoping to tempt the monks into breaking their vows. I genuinely cannot decide if that story is more alarming or more absurd, possibly both. Either way, Benedict looked at the situation and decided that staying was creating more drama than it was worth, and left Subiaco entirely. He travelled south 80 miles below Rome to a mountain called Monte Cassino. He found a pagan temple at the summit dedicated to the god Apollo of all people, and he demolished it. and in its place, sometime around the year 529, he built a monastery. It was there in the final years of his life that he sat down and wrote the document that would outlast almost everything else produced in his century, the Rule of St. Benedict, 73 chapters, in Latin. A document that if you were to print it out today would fit comfortably in your jacket pocket, and yet it is without exaggeration one of the most consequential pieces of writing in the history of Western civilization. Here is what I love most about it, and the reason I think it survived when so many other grand ideas from the same era did not. Benedict was not an idealist. He was not writing a utopia. He was writing a practical manual for flawed human beings trying to live together without destroying each other. About half of the rule, roughly half, is dedicated to the practice of obedience and humility, not as abstract virtues, but as concrete daily habits. The other half is split between the spiritual ordering of the day and the very unglamorous business of running a community who does the cooking, who tends the sick, how conflicts get resolved, what happens when a monk breaks the rules, how guests should be received. And on the question of guests, chapter 53 of the rule says something that I find quietly extraordinary. It instructs the monks to receive every visitor as though they were receiving Christ himself, every traveller, every stranger who knocks at the gate, not just the wealthy ones, not just the important ones, every single one to be met with courtesy and care, as though the face behind that dusty cloak might be divine. In a world where most roads were dangerous and most strangers were treated with suspicion, that instruction alone placed monasteries in a category entirely of their own. Then there is chapter 48, which contains perhaps the most quotable single line in the entire document. Benedict writes, and I want you to really hear this, he writes, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." Just 5 words. And from those 5 words flowed an entire philosophy of structured time that would shape European culture for the next 1,000 years. Because if idleness is the enemy, then the solution is not merely prayer, it is purposeful rhythm. Prayer and work, study and labour. The Latin phrase that became the unofficial motto of Benedictine life forever after ora et labora. Pray and work. Benedict divided the ideal monastic day into 3 equal parts of roughly 8 hours, each 8 hours of prayer and worship, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of productive labour. No hour wasted, no moment left to drift into the kind of aimless wandering he had seen destroy so many lives in Rome. Does that formula sound familiar to you? 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of personal time. The framework that labour movements in the 19th century would fight for that modern workplace psychology still debates. The roots of that idea are older than the Industrial Revolution by about 13 centuries. They start in a cave near Subiaco with a teenager who was disgusted by what he saw and decided to try something different. Now here is the detail that I think is the most remarkable of all, and the one that gets left out of most retellings. Benedict died around the year 547. Monte Cassino, the monastery he built, was destroyed by the Lombards, a Germanic people who swept through Italy just a few decades after his death. The monks fled. The buildings were burned. Everything that Benedict had constructed physically was gone. But the rule survived. Copies had been made and carried to Rome, and around the year 594 a pope named Gregory I, a man of genuine intellectual depth who would later be called Gregory the Great, read the rule and wrote about it with unmistakable admiration. He praised both the document and its author, and that endorsement, coming from the most powerful religious figure in the Western world, launched the rule into an entirely different orbit. By the early 8th century, Benedictine monks from England were travelling through continental Europe, spreading the rule as the definitive guide to monastic life. By the early 9th century, under the patronage of Charlemagne, It became the required standard for every monastery in the Carolingian Empire, what is now roughly France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and northern Italy. From one man's attempt to escape the world, an entire civilization found its organizing principle. There is a phrase carved into the tradition of Monte Cassino, a Latin phrase that the monks still use today, even after the abbey was nearly destroyed again during the Second World War successa virescit. It means roughly, a severed root blooms again. The idea that no destruction is total, that something living, if it carries real truth in it, finds a way back. I think Benedict would have appreciated that. I think he would have found it perfectly consistent with everything he believed. But here is the thing about the rule that we need to sit with for a moment, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where my personal feelings about it are frankly a little mixed. The rule was wise. The rule was humane by the standards of its time. Benedict explicitly condemned harsh treatment of monks, emphasized care for the sick, insisted that the abbot lead by example rather than fear. He wrote that a good abbot must so arrange everything that the strong have something to yearn for and the weak have nothing to run from. That is a beautiful sentence. That is the kind of leadership philosophy you would find in a modern management book, and it was written 1500 years ago, and yet the rule also contained a small, quiet chapter. Chapter 59 that allowed for something that, when you sit with it long enough, is quite difficult to reconcile with all that wisdom and care. It allowed parents to bring their children to the monastery, to hand them over, permanently. Before those children were old enough to understand what they were agreeing to, before they were old enough to choose anything at all. And that chapter, that one quiet provision, opened a door through which something very significant entered the story of monastic life. What happened behind that door is where we are headed next, and I want you to stay with me because this chapter of the story is one that history has mostly left in the shadows, and it deserves the light. That chapter, Chapter 59 of the rule, did not describe an extraordinary or controversial practice. It described something ordinary, something so accepted, so woven into the fabric of medieval aristocratic life, that it barely warranted comment in most of the historical sources that survive. And yet when you stop and look at it directly, really look at what it meant in the lives of individual human beings, it is one of the more unsettling things in this entire story. Let me read you what Chapter 59 actually said in its essential terms. If a nobleman or a poor man wishes to offer his son to God in the monastery, if he has no property to give with him, he may wrap the boy's hand in the altar cloth along with his petition and offer him at the altar. That is the ceremony. That is how you gave your child to a monastery in the medieval world. You wrapped his small hand in cloth, you laid it on the altar, and you walked away. The word for such a child was oblate, from the Latin oblatus, meaning an offering, a thing presented. The practice was ancient well before Benedict formalized it, but the rule gave it institutional legitimacy, and from the 6th century onward through the 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, it became one of the primary, in some eras the dominant method by which Benedictine monasteries recruited their membership. Not by persuading adults in the grip of spiritual crisis to renounce the world, by receiving children before the world had fully shown itself to them. The typical oblate was between 5 and 7 years old when he arrived, old enough to walk through the gate, old enough to remember later what his father's face looked like when he turned away, not old enough to understand the permanence of what was happening or the meaning of the vow that was being made in his name. This is the part I want to sit with for a moment because I think it deserves it. A 7-year-old child in the medieval understanding, a child who had reached the age of reason, old enough to know right from wrong, was considered legally capable of consenting to an oblation, and the legal fiction was maintained that the consent was genuine. In practice, the child had no more meaningful choice in the matter than in any other arrangement made for him by the adults who controlled his life. The consent was performed. The hand was wrapped in cloth. The child was offered, and then the monks took him in, and the gate closed, and in many cases that was the last time the boy would see his family. I want to give you a specific face for this practice because history is most real when it belongs to someone. The year is 1085. A French priest named Odalerius, living in Shropshire in England, arrives at the Abbey of Saint-Evroul in Normandy with his 10-year-old son. The boy's name is Orderic. He has dark eyes. He does not speak French, only English and some Latin. He is, by his own later description, utterly bewildered by this journey across the Channel to a stone building full of strangers in a land whose language is not his own. His father has paid 30 silver marks for his admission. 30 marks. That was roughly the price of a good horse. The handover according to the historical record that Orderic himself later wrote, and this is the detail I cannot get past no matter how many times I come back to it. The handover involved both of them crying. The father handing his eldest son to a monk named Reginald was weeping. The boy was weeping. They held each other and then they let go. And then Odalerius walked away. Odalerius and Orderic never saw each other again. Orderic grew up inside those walls. He became a monk, an ordained priest, a master scribe, a librarian, a historian of extraordinary range and perception. His chronicle, the Historia Ecclesiastica, is one of the most vivid and reliable records of 11th and 12th century Norman and English history that we possess. Scholars rely on it today. He wrote it over the course of decades in the scriptorum at Saint-Evroul, and in the final pages of that massive work as an old man in his 70s, he wrote a passage about his own arrival as an oblate. He called himself in those pages like Joseph in a strange land. The biblical Joseph, the son sold into exile by his brothers, separated from his father Jacob by deception, making a life in a foreign country with strangers who did not know his name. Joseph in a strange land. That is how a man in his 70s remembered himself at 10. 70 years later. The image had not softened. Now let me complicate this because the history is not simple, and I want to respect its full dimensions. The people who made these decisions, the parents who wrapped their children's hands in altar cloth, were not in most cases monsters or negligent strangers to their own children. They were people operating within a set of values and beliefs that genuinely made the oblation feel like an act of love and care. The monastery was by every available measure a far more secure, comfortable and intellectually rich environment than most of the alternatives available in the medieval world. Monks were among the best-fed people in Europe. They were housed in stone buildings with roofs that did not leak. They learned Latin, they learned to read, they learned to write. In a world where literacy was extraordinarily rare, and where the options for most well-born younger sons amounted to military service, or a life of dependency on an elder brother's charity, the monastery offered something genuinely valuable, a place of dignity, intellectual cultivation, and material security that could not be taken away by inheritance law or battlefield fortune. Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most extraordinary minds of the 12th century, a composer, a theologian, a physician, a mystic, a woman who argued with popes and kept winning, was sent to the Benedictine convent of Disibodenberg in what is now Germany when she was approximately 7 years old. She was the youngest of 10 children born in the year 1098. She'd been having visions since the age of 3. Her parents, confronted with a sensitive, unusual child with experiences they could not explain, placed her with the best educated community of women they could access. The abbess who received her was a woman named Jutta, only 6 years older than Hildegard herself, who taught her to read, to write, to play the psaltery and to chant the office. Their friendship lasted until Jutta's death. Hildegard, at the age of 38, was unanimously elected to succeed her. The child who had no say in the matter grew up to write 77 musical compositions, more surviving chants than any other composer from the entire Middle Ages. She invented a constructed language. She corresponded with emperors and popes and frequently told them they were wrong. She founded not one but 2 monasteries of her own choosing, and she entered the cloister at the age of 7 with no say in the matter. Both of those facts are true simultaneously. I think we have to hold both of them. What did the daily life of a child oblate actually look like? It started as everything in a monastery started with the bell. And here is where I want you to feel this rather than just hear it described. A 7-year-old boy sometime in the 10th or 11th century rising from his narrow wooden bed in the communal dormitory at 2 in the morning. It is cold. The stone floor is cold under his bare feet. The older monks around him are rising too, pulling on habits with the practiced efficiency of long habit. But the child is still half asleep, stumbling toward the door in the dark. He goes to matins. He stands or kneels in the church for the first service of the day. He is expected to stay awake. He is expected to chant. He is perhaps 6 or 7 years old. Oblates followed the full divine office. All 8 services. The 2 o'clock matins, the dawn, lords the 6 o'clock prime on through the day to Compline at nightfall. No exemptions for age. No modified schedule for the youngest members of the community. The same bells that govern the adult monks govern the children. The same silence at meals, the same communal prayers, the same posture of obedience. The rule of Saint Benedict in its provision for oblates who misbehaved was explicit. Those too young to understand excommunication were to be corrected by fasting or physical punishment. The Constitutions of Lanfranc, the guide for monastic life at Canterbury, written by the Archbishop who had himself come up through the monastic school system, specified the conditions under which oblate children could be struck. The language was careful and controlled, but the practice it described was real. I am not recounting this to shock. I am recounting it because the oblate's life was genuinely hard, and the histories that romanticize it because those children sometimes became extraordinary adults do the full story a disservice. At the same time, the monastic school was, and this is the tension that runs through everything about the oblate system, one of the only genuine educational institutions available anywhere in early medieval Europe. The curriculum, such as it was, centered on Latin. Reading the Psalms, writing chant, some arithmetic for calculating the liturgical calendar. By the 8th century, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, were taught in theory, though in practice the education was primarily religious and practical, rather than philosophically comprehensive. But even that was extraordinary by the standards of the surrounding society. In a world where perhaps 5% of the population could read, the monastery school produced young men of genuine learning. The Venerable Bede, the greatest English scholar of the early medieval period, the man who gave us the system of dating years from the birth of Christ, the man whose ecclesiastical history of the English people remained a primary source for early medieval England, was 7 years old when he was sent as an oblate to the monastery at Monkwearmouth in Northumbria. 7. And that monastery gave him access to one of the finest libraries in northern Europe. Alcuin of York, the scholar who became the central intellectual figure of Charlemagne's court, who directed the Carolingian educational revival that produced the first universities, may have been even younger than 7 when he was sent to the cathedral school at York. These are not edge cases. These are the most distinguished intellectual figures of their era, and they entered religious education as small children who did not choose to be there. The question of choice, or rather its absence, hung over the oblate system throughout its history, and eventually the Church asked the question directly. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 the most sweeping reform council of the medieval church effectively ended the practice of child oblation in Western monasticism. The council declared that children could not make binding monastic vows. A person who'd been placed in a monastery as a child was free upon reaching adulthood to leave. The life had to be chosen, not simply inherited. And the extraordinary thing is most of them stayed. The historical records show that the overwhelming majority of oblates who reached the age of majority, who are by the council's new ruling free to walk out of the gate and return to the world, chose not to. They took their vows willingly. They remained. What does that tell us? I've turned this question over for a long time, and I don't think there is one clean answer. Some of them undoubtedly stayed because the monastery was the only world they knew, having arrived at 5 or 7. The cloister was simply home and the outside world was the foreign country. Some stayed because the alternatives genuinely offered less a world of inheritance politics and military violence, and the chronic insecurity of lay life compared to the guaranteed material security and intellectual richness of the cloister. Some stayed because against all the odds of circumstance and compulsion, they had found something real inside those walls. Something that felt like calling, even if the calling had been arranged by their parents before they were old enough to have one. Audric Vitalis, who compared himself to Joseph in a strange land, who wept when his father left, who spent the rest of his long life at Saint-Evroul, he also produced in that same monastery one of the great historical chronicles of his era. He became by his own quiet account something that he could not have become anywhere else. The land that felt strange at 10 became over decades the only land he knew. Now here is the thought that I want to leave you with from this chapter, because it is the one that has stayed with me the longest. The oblate system was by modern standards something we would not permit. The absence of genuine consent from the child is real and serious, and I am not going to paper over it with admiration for the outcomes it occasionally produced. But the world that produced it was not randomly or uniquely cruel. It was a world in which childhood as a protected phase of life deserving special rights simply did not exist in the way we understand it. It was a world in which parents regularly arranged every significant decision about their children's futures, marriage, occupation, place of residence without consultation. The oblate was not unusual in being a child whose path had been chosen for him. He was unusual only in the particular path chosen, and the people who received these children, the monks who were their teachers, their models, their daily companions for the whole of their forming years, were often, by all available evidence, genuinely kind to them. The rule itself specified that the young must be handled with patience, that allowances must be made for their age, that care must be taken not to drive them away by harshness. The records show instances of real warmth between monastic teachers and their oblate students. The friendships formed in those years could last a lifetime. In a community where you rose with the same people at 2 a.m. for 40 years, you were not strangers. And what those children learned, the Latin, the music, the texts, the habits of mind formed by years of reading and prayer and structured time, that learning went back out into the world with them whenever they left, carrying the mark of the cloister wherever they went. The monastery's most intimate and enduring legacy was not its buildings, it was the people it formed, the minds it shaped, the books it produced in cold rooms by those who'd been brought to the gates as children and had stayed to become in their own strange and specific way exactly what they were always meant to be. But those people once formed faced a daily life that was even more peculiar than we have yet described. Because one of the most basic human activities, the ability to simply speak, to say something aloud to the person beside you, had been systematically, deliberately, and with elaborate institutional engineering removed. And what happened when you take a community of intelligent, observant, energetic people and forbid them from speaking what they invented to replace language, how they communicated in the silence, and just how spectacularly strange the results became, is exactly where we are going next. So, you take a community of people intelligent, educated, living at extraordinarily close quarters, and you forbid them from speaking, not just in one room. In the church, silence. In the kitchen, silence. In the dormitory, silence. In the refectory while eating, silence. In the corridors between offices, silence. The rule of Saint Benedict was not ambiguous about this. Benedict wrote directly that permission to speak should seldom be given. He quoted Proverbs in much talking you shall not escape sin. He listed the areas where silence was required. He described the spirit in which all speech, even necessary speech, should be conducted quietly with gravity and few words. The monks, as we have established, were not angels. They were human beings with opinions and hunger and cold feet, and things they urgently needed to communicate to the person standing 3 feet away from them, and so they invented something. Let me tell you about a manuscript that sits in the British Library in London catalogued as Cotton Tiberius A3. It dates from the mid-11th century, and it was produced at Christ Church in Canterbury, the great Benedictine cathedral priory that was at that time one of the most important monasteries in England. Tucked inside this manuscript between a copy of the Benedictine Rule and the Regularis Concordia, the set of monastic customs that governed English Benedictine life, is a short text written in Old English. It occupies 5 folio pages. Its title translated means Monastic Signs. Its contents are 127 individual hand gestures described in careful Old English used by the monks of Canterbury when the rule forbade them to speak. 127 signs, written down, formally documented, transmitted in a manuscript preserved with the same care as sacred scripture. That manuscript is the oldest surviving example of a monastic sign language in England. And what it contains, when you read it closely, is one of the most unexpectedly human documents from the entire Middle Ages. Let me tell you what some of these signs actually looked like. The sign for bread, the most essential food in the monastery eaten at every meal, was to make a circle with both thumbs and forefingers joined together, as though forming the shape of a round loaf. The sign for fish, given how important fish was to the monastic diet, was to move your hand the way a fish moves through water. Simple, intuitive. The same gesture you or I might make today if we were miming a swimming fish to a child. The sign for the abbot, the supreme authority in the monastery, the man before whom you bowed and whose hand you kissed in reverence, was to place 2 fingers on your head and simultaneously grab a lock of your own hair. The reasoning behind the hair pulling I have never fully been able to reconstruct, but I suspect it had something to do with the tonsure, the distinctive shaved crown that all monks wore. The sign for milk at the Cluniac monasteries in France was performed by imitating a suckling baby, the little finger placed at the lips. The monks of Hirsau in Germany used a different sign for the same thing. They mimicked the milking of a cow by tugging gently at the little finger of their left hand. I want you to sit with the image of a room full of men in dark habits, eating in complete formal silence, and one of them suddenly tugging at his own little finger to request milk. The Canterbury document, the Monasterialis Indicia, also reveals something specific and quietly wonderful about the difference between monastic communities in different countries. The French sign lexicon from Cluny, one of the earliest documented sign systems, contains signs for a number of rather luxurious foods, spiced drinks, delicacies, and crepes. Yes, specifically, crepes, the thin French pancakes that apparently appeared often enough at Cluniac tables to warrant their own dedicated hand gesture. The Canterbury document has no sign for crepes. Canterbury monks apparently never encountered them, or if they did, not frequently enough to justify a gesture. Instead, the Anglo-Saxon sign lexicon is dominated by practical spare vocabulary, vegetables, grains, basic tools, the books used in the divine office, the objects of daily monastic work. The French monks had a sign for a rich dessert. The English monks had a sign for their latrine. That contrast tells you something specific and real about the difference in daily life between a prosperous French Benedictine house at its peak and an Anglo-Saxon monastery living a somewhat more austere existence. The vocabulary of a sign language reflects the world of its speakers as precisely as any other kind of language. Now here is where the story gets genuinely entertaining, and I want you to know that this next part is historically documented, not embellished. Around the year 1180, a Welsh churchman and writer named Gerald, who would later become known as Gerald of Wales, one of the most vivid and opinionated diarists of the medieval period, visited Christ Church at Canterbury. He was a guest at dinner seated in the refectory, while the monks ate in their required silence. He watched what unfolded around him, and he was not impressed. In his own words, as recorded in his autobiography, the monks were gesticulating with their fingers, their hands, and their arms. They were whistling to each other. The whole scene had in his description the quality of a theatrical performance, or more precisely given the era of jesters at a feast. He wrote that he thought it would have been more consonant with good order and decency to speak modestly in human speech than to indulge ridiculously in this mute chatter. This is the irony that I find quietly delicious about the whole history of monastic sign language. Benedict had required silence in order to prevent exactly the kind of social chatter that he found spiritually dangerous: idle talk, gossip, distraction, laughter. The monks had complied with the letter of that requirement by developing a signing system so elaborate, so expressive, and so enthusiastically deployed that a visitor watching them use it felt like he was sitting in the middle of a performance. St. Benedict had set out to create silence and had accidentally created theatre, but the sign language was not only a workaround for practical needs like requesting bread or indicating that you needed to visit the latrine. It was also, and this is the dimension that I find genuinely moving, a way of maintaining community under conditions designed to minimize it. Think about what daily life in a monastery actually required communicatively across an ordinary day. Someone needed to know where a specific book was shelved. Someone needed to indicate that a candle was dangerously low. Someone in the scriptorum needed a fresh quill and could not interrupt the silence to ask. Someone in the garden had found a problem with the irrigation channel and needed to tell the monk responsible for water management. In each of these cases, the silence had to be maintained, but the practical community had to function. The signing system was the solution. It was in a very real sense the infrastructure of a community that had chosen to operate under extreme communicative constraints, and like all infrastructure, it expanded to meet demand. The Cluniac sign system, which originated at the Abbey of Cluny in the late 10th century and spread to daughter houses across Europe, eventually grew to contain signs not just for food and basic objects, but for emotional and social states, for theological concepts, for hierarchical relationships. There were signs indicating respect, permission, gratitude, signs distinguishing different kinds of religious authority, signs for different categories of food based on their ritual status, whether they were permitted on fast days, whether they were considered a luxury. The system was documented, copied into manuals, and transmitted from monastery to monastery as carefully as any other aspect of the rule. When a monk travelled from one Benedictine house to another, which happened regularly as scholars and teachers moved between communities, he carried the sign vocabulary of his home monastery and encountered the different vocabulary of his host. The regional variations accumulated. The Cluniacs had their idiom. The Canterbury monks had theirs. The German monasteries influenced by Hirsau had their own. It is not technically a language in the full sense that modern linguists use that word. It lacks the grammatical completeness, the generative capacity, the expressive range of a natural language. but it is something genuinely remarkable, a system of communication that developed spontaneously and organically out of the specific needs and constraints of a specific kind of community. It is a window unique in all of medieval history into the texture of daily monastic life, what monks actually needed to say to each other, what objects and activities mattered enough to receive their own dedicated gesture. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this seems like exactly the right moment for it. When you think of silence as a spiritual practice, as a deliberate chosen constraint on speech, what comes to mind? Does it sound appealing? Restful? Maybe the idea of a life where you're not required to perform, to fill every pause with words to maintain the endless social running commentary that most of us manage all day, because the monastery's silence was nothing like that. It was not a peaceful retreat from noise. It was a discipline, something required, maintained by institutional rule, backed by the threat of correction for violations. The silence was a form of structured difficulty deliberately imposed. It was meant to be hard, and the monks, being human, found their way around it. Not by violating it openly, for the most part they maintained the letter of the requirement, but by pushing language itself into new shapes, by discovering that the human need to communicate is so fundamental, so irreducible, that even in a community dedicated to silence it finds a way to persist. 127 hand signs preserved in a library in London. A Welsh visitor scandalised by monks whistling at each other over dinner. The little finger pressed to the lips to ask for milk. The two-fingered gesture that meant the most powerful man in your world. These are the signs of people who were required to be silent and refused at some essential level to stop communicating. Now the silence itself, the theological idea behind it, was considerably more sophisticated than simply stop making noise, and I think it deserves its full weight. Benedict's instructions about silence were rooted in a specific belief about the relationship between speech and the soul. The danger of words in his understanding was not primarily that they disturbed others, it was that they disturbed the speaker. Idle talk was a form of spiritual dissipation, a leakage of attention from God toward the world. The person who chattered, gossiped, laughed loudly, spoke of trivial things, was a person whose inner life was constantly being pulled outward toward distraction. The Cluniac reform of the 10th and 11th centuries took this idea further than any previous monastic tradition. The monks of Cluny did not simply restrict unnecessary speech, they interpreted silence as a positive virtue, an active state of spiritual receptivity, not merely the absence of noise. Their foundation charter described the Cluniac goal as the heavenly way of life. The silence of the monastery was meant to be the silence of angels who existed in the constant presence of God without the need for the mediating noise of human language. That is an extraordinarily ambitious spiritual claim, and the monks who lived within it, who rose before dawn and kept silence through the cold corridors and the dark church and the communal meals where no one spoke, were attempting with sincere conviction to inhabit it daily. Whether any of them actually achieved angelic silence is of course a matter that lies beyond the reach of historical documentation. What the documents show us is the attempt. There was alongside the formal sign language a parallel and rather charming phenomenon, the informal innovations that monks developed on their own, when the official vocabulary of the sign system failed to cover a particular situation. The documented manuals represent standardized transmitted vocabulary, but daily life generates endless situations that standardized vocabulary cannot anticipate. A monk who needed to communicate something unusual, something not covered by the 127 Canterbury signs or the Cluniac system, had to improvise. The historical record contains glimpses of these improvisations. A monk who needed to convey a more complex message would sometimes use combinations of existing signs in sequence, stringing them together like words into a kind of spontaneous sentence. Others relied on what Gerald of Wales described as the full expressive repertoire of the human face and body eyebrow movements, significant glances, tilts of the head, subtle pointing. One anecdote preserved in the record shows a monk communicating the need to visit the latrine by grabbing his habit near the groin with 2 fingers and shaking it lightly. The detail is preserved in a monastic chronicle, with the same sober matter-of-factness as theological commentary, because in a community where silence was law, and the body's needs were constant practical communication, required practical solutions regardless of their dignity. And then there is the warming room, in the monastery complex, that carefully designed set of stone buildings organised around the cloister. There was in many houses one specific space where the great silence did not fully apply. The calefactory, as it was called in Latin, the warming room, was typically the only heated room in the monastery aside from the kitchen. Monks could go there to warm themselves in winter, and in many communities the warming room was also the one space where restricted conversation was genuinely permitted. The warmth and the speech were connected, and not only practically. There was an implicit acknowledgement in this arrangement that the human need for warmth and the human need to speak were of a similar order, both bodily necessities that could not be entirely suppressed without risk to health, both allowable in their proper place, and measure both carefully bounded by the institutional framework of the monastery. I find something quietly honest about that. The rule maintained its vision of a life organised around silence and prayer, but it also built into the architecture of the monastery a heated room where you could talk. The sign language that the monks developed has one more dimension that I want to give its proper weight before we move on. The Monasteriales Indicia, those 127 Canterbury signs, is not only a linguistic document, it is a social document. What a community chooses to name, chooses to assign a gesture to tells you what that community considers important enough to mention, even when speech is forbidden. The vocabulary of the signs is in effect a portrait of what mattered in daily monastic life. Food and drink mattered enormously. The majority of the signs relate to eating and the objects of the refectory. The books of the liturgy mattered. There were signs for different categories of manuscript. Authority mattered, the signs for the abbot. The prior, the various obedientiary monks distinguished clearly between different levels of the hierarchy. The body's needs mattered, the latrine illness rest. And buried quietly in the list of Canterbury signs there are signs for a priest who was married and for a priest who was not. That detail is remarkable. It means that in the mid-11th century, when the Canterbury document was compiled, priestly marriage was common enough, or had been common enough recently enough, that Canterbury monks needed a specific gesture to distinguish married priests from unmarried ones. The practice was officially condemned and eventually banned by the First Lateran Council in 1123. But the sign survived in the document, preserved like an insect in amber evidence of a world that was in the middle of changing, recorded without comment in the practical vocabulary of daily silent life. The monastery's silence, in the end, tells us something about the nature of language that transcends the medieval world entirely. You cannot fully suppress the human need to communicate. You can shape it, channel it, impose constraints on it. You can require that it take unconventional forms. But the impulse itself, the drive to reach toward another person, to make yourself understood, to say something that matters, persists in spite of everything. The monks who tug their little fingers for milk, who press 2 fingers to their heads, to indicate the abbot who gestured so wildly that a Welsh visitor thought he had stumbled into a performance. Those monks were not failing at silence. They were demonstrating in the most human way imaginable that the aspiration to silence and the reality of human community will always exist in creative tension, that a person can hold both, can genuinely honour the discipline and also genuinely need to communicate without either destroying the other. The rule required silence. the monks kept it more or less, and they filled it with everything language could be when words themselves were forbidden. Which brings us to a question I want to carry forward into the next part of this story. If the silence shaped how they spoke, what did the cold shape? Because the monks' bodies, not just their voices, but their sleep, their rest, their physical experience of the hours between the bell and the next bell were subject to constraints just as demanding, just as deliberately designed and carrying just as many hidden consequences. The dormitory at 2 a.m, the wooden bed without a mattress, the stone floor under bare feet in January, what the body endures in the service of a chosen discipline, and what that endurance costs, that is where we are headed now. And I think you will find it both harder and more interesting than you might expect. There is something I find endlessly entertaining about human nature across all of history, and it is this: the moment you tell people they cannot have something, they immediately begin constructing elaborate philosophical arguments for why actually they can. Politicians do it, lawyers do it, your friends do it. And as it turns out, medieval monks sworn to poverty, silence, and self-denial, living inside the most rule-governed institutions on earth, were absolutely spectacular at it. Tonight's chapter of this story is on the surface about food, but what it is really about is something far more universal: the gap between who we say we are and who we actually are when nobody is watching. Or in this case, when God is supposedly watching, but dinner smells very good. Let's go back to the rule for a moment, because we need to establish the baseline before we appreciate how magnificently it was dismantled. Benedict, as we have seen, was a man of deep conviction and genuine ascetic instinct. When it came to food, he was unmistakably clear. The rule prescribed a diet built around bread, legumes, cooked vegetables, and seasonal fruit. Simple, nourishing, humble. Monks were to eat once a day in winter, and perhaps a second lighter meal added in summer, when the days were longer and the body needed more fuel for labour. Meat specifically, the flesh of 4-legged animals, was reserved exclusively for the sick and the infirm. Healthy monks simply did not eat it. Water was the expected drink. Wine was permitted because Benedict was a pragmatist who understood that denying wine entirely to men living in wine-producing regions was a battle no abbot was going to win, but even wine was rationed and monks were warned repeatedly against excess. The spirit of the thing was unmistakable. Food was fuel, not pleasure. The table was not a place of enjoyment but of necessity and scripture, since meals were eaten in the refectory, while a reader spoke aloud from sacred texts. You sat, you ate what was placed before you, you listened to the word of God, and you went back to your duties. That was the vision. Now, I want to tell you what actually happened. It started, as these things often do, with a technicality. The rule said with great specificity that monks could not eat the muscle flesh of 4-legged animals. Notice what it did not say. It did not say anything about internal organs. And so, within a few generations, a quiet consensus emerged in many Benedictine houses that offal, the entrails, the kidneys, the stomach did not technically count as meat. Sheep's intestines cooked in ale with breadcrumbs and spices, a dish known as umbles, appeared on monastery tables. Tongue in sauce, minced offal pressed into pastry. These were fine, apparently, because the rule had said nothing specific about them. Then came the next creative leap. Benedictine and Cluniac monks, and I say this with complete admiration for their ingenuity, determined that the method of preparation changed the nature of the food itself. Fresh meat from the joint carved straight from the bone that was clearly prohibited, but meat that had been pre-cooked, minced and reconstituted into something else. Meatballs, let's say, or rissoles, was not in their careful interpretation quite the same thing. You were not eating meat in its original form. You were eating a processed product. The distinction was, to put it charitably, philosophically ambitious, but it held. Then came the room, This is where I think the true genius of medieval monastic creativity reveals itself. Benedictine monasteries gradually developed a separate dining space called the Misericorde, and the Misericorde had one remarkable, quietly revolutionary property. The rule of Saint Benedict did not technically apply within its walls. How this reasoning was justified I cannot fully reconstruct. But the practical effect was extraordinary. Monks would rotate between the refectory where the rule held and the Misericorde where it did not. In the Misericorde, roast meat could be served openly. Pork, beef, game birds, all of it. When Pope Benedict XII, sitting in Avignon, clearly aware that something had gone very wrong, ruled in the year 1336 that at least half of all monks must eat in the refectory, on any given day the monasteries did not abandon the Misericorde. They simply recalculated who counted. The sick were excluded from the tally. Those invited to dine at the abbot's table were excluded. Using these exemptions creatively, they could consistently push the number eating in the refectory below half, while technically appearing to comply. It is genuinely some of the most impressive regulatory evasion in recorded history. But even this was not the most extraordinary chapter of the story. That honour belongs to the great theological debate over what exactly constitutes a fish. Let me explain. The rule and the broader church calendar imposed frequent fasting days throughout the year, Wednesdays and Saturdays in the earlier medieval period, and Fridays always, as well as the 40 days of Lent and the weeks of Advent. On those days meat was forbidden, but fish was permitted, and so the question that occupied some of the finest minds of the Middle Ages was not, as you might hope, the nature of the soul or the structure of the cosmos. It was, is this particular animal a fish? The conclusions reached were, and I say this as someone who has spent considerable time with this material extraordinary. The beaver, for instance, was deemed acceptable to eat on fast days. The reasoning a beaver has a scaly tail and spends a great deal of time in water, therefore at least in its tail region it was fish. The fact that the rest of the animal is emphatically, unmistakably a mammal was set aside in favour of the tail. Medieval illustrators actually drew images of the beaver with an elaborate fishtail to make the argument visually persuasive. I genuinely cannot decide if this is brilliant or absurd. Possibly both. The barnacle goose received similar treatment. This small black and white migratory bird spends its winters in Western Europe, appearing suddenly each autumn from seemingly nowhere, because medieval naturalists had not yet grasped the concept of Arctic breeding grounds. The conclusion drawn was that barnacle geese did not hatch from eggs laid on land, but instead grew from the goose barnacles attached to driftwood floating in the sea. They were therefore aquatic in origin, and therefore fish. An English knight named John Mandeville, writing in the 14th century, described these barnacles attached to trees above the water, dropping into the sea and becoming geese. He was entirely serious, and the classification stuck in many places. Puffins were declared fish by more than one religious house on the grounds of their coastal habits. The Benedictine Abbey of Le Tréport in northern France got into significant trouble with the Archbishop of Rouen when it was discovered that the monks were regularly eating puffins on fast days, arguing with complete conviction that the birds lived among the waves and were therefore aquatic. And then there is perhaps the most audacious claim of all one made not by a hungry monk in a cold refectory, but by one of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas, the man whose theological writings are still studied in universities today, a thinker of breathtaking intellectual range, concluded based on what he understood of natural history that chickens were originally aquatic creatures, and therefore chicken was fish, and therefore chicken could be eaten on fast days. I want to sit with that for a moment. St. Thomas Aquinas, chickens, fish. His exact reasoning involved a theory about how certain birds emerged from water at the time of creation, which made them fundamentally aquatic in essence, even if they currently lived on land. Now, I would never presume to argue with one of history's great philosophers about the nature of divine creation, but I will note that if you put a chicken in a pond, what happens is not encouraging for the fish theory. What makes all of this genuinely fascinating beyond the obvious comedy of it is what it reveals about the human relationship with rules and desire. Because these monks were not cynical people by and large, they were not sitting around scheming to undermine a system they secretly hated. Many of them genuinely believed in what they were doing. They prayed, they kept their hours, they copied their manuscripts and tended their gardens and cared for their sick with sincere devotion. And yet, when dinner was on the table and the smell of roasted pork drifted through the stone corridors, human nature, it turns out, is remarkably consistent across the centuries. The results of all this creative reinterpretation were documented in the historical record with wonderful specificity. Records from Westminster Abbey in the late 15th century show that each monk was entitled to 2¼ pounds of bread per day, 5 eggs per day except on Fridays, and during Lent 2 pounds of fish on 3 days of the week, and on the remaining 4 days, the flesh days, 2 full pounds of actual meat. Pork, beef, mutton, veal, suckling pig, swan, goose, chicken, and critically there was no stated limit on beer. Westminster allocated each monk 1 full gallon of beer per day, a gallon per day per monk. Now, before you judge water in medieval England was genuinely unreliable. Beer was safer, more nutritious and more caloric. It served a practical function. But when you add up the numbers, the result is striking. Historians have calculated that on feast days the plates loaded in front of Westminster monks may have contained up to 7,000 calories. Even on days officially designated as abstinence days, when the brothers were supposed to be fasting, the figure was around 4,000 calories. Today, the recommended daily intake for an average adult man is around 2,500. The monks were eating on their lightest days at roughly 1.5 times that, and it showed. Archaeological remains from medieval monastery sites have revealed skeletal evidence of obesity-related joint disease. Medieval literature noticed it too. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, included a monk in his Canterbury Tales, and described the man flatly as a lord full of fat. The image of the round, well-fed, rosy-cheeked monk became so established as a cultural shorthand that it was practically its own genre of satire. The Abbot of Cluny in France, a formidable man named Peter the Venerable, wrote with barely concealed fury about the eating habits he observed in some Benedictine houses during the 12th century. I am paraphrasing here, but his description is precise, and I want you to feel the indignation in it. He wrote that beans, cheese, eggs and fish had all become sources of disgust to certain monks, that roast and boiled pork fat heifers, rabbit hair, goose chicken, and every kind of meat covered the tables of these holy brothers. He called them holy monks with the kind of emphasis that suggests he meant anything but, and yet, and this is the part I always come back to, the part that complicates the easy cynicism, the picture was not uniform. Because while all of this abundance was happening in the larger, wealthier houses, there were communities living the original vision with ferocious sincerity. The Cistercians, established in 1098 specifically as a correction to what they saw as Benedictine excess, took their dietary restrictions to an extreme that made everyone else uncomfortable. They banned meat even for the sick, even for the dying. Even Hugh of Lincoln, a deeply respected Carthusian bishop who would later be declared a saint, had to be talked into eating a small portion of pig's feet by the Archbishop of Canterbury and several other distinguished men when he fell gravely ill. He could barely swallow it. His body, after years of total abstinence, had essentially forgotten how. Other Cistercian houses became so defensive about their reputation for strictness that one 14th century monk actually wrote an entire treatise, arguing that Cistercians were healthier than Benedictines, because of the superior diet, you understand. Competitive fasting had arrived. Meanwhile, Walter Map, a witty 12th century Welsh cleric who clearly enjoyed poking fun at religious institutions, wrote about the Cistercians with delightful mischief. He noted that Cistercian monasteries sold bacon from their pigs, but they did not, according to Walter, sell the rest of the pig or throw it away. He wrote with a shrug you can practically hear across 9 centuries. What becomes of them, God knows. There is something I find genuinely moving about this whole chapter underneath all the comedy. Because what you are watching across the span of 5 or 6 centuries is a slow negotiation between an ideal and reality, between what human beings aspire to be and what they actually are at the end of a cold, difficult day when hunger is real and the smell of food is very close. The monks who invented the misericord, who classified puffins as fish and debated the aquatic origins of chickens, they were not villains. They were not even really hypocrites, not most of them. They were people. People living inside an institution that demanded more of them than most human beings can consistently give, trying to honour the spirit of something they genuinely believed in while finding the edges of what was survivable. And honestly, I think Benedict himself understood this. He built flexibility into the rule from the start. He wrote that abbots should adapt the schedule according to season and need. He wrote that wine, though perhaps not ideal, was a concession to the realities of human weakness. He was not designing a system for angels. He was designing one for people. The fat monk in Chaucer's portrait is easy to mock, but look a little closer, and what you see is something more human than ridiculous, someone who came to a monastery seeking God and found along the way that he was still a person with a body and an appetite and all the contradictions that come with being alive. That tension between sacred aspiration and very human limitation runs through almost every corner of life inside those monastery walls, and nowhere is it more visible, nowhere does it burn more brightly and cost more dearly than in the room we're about to walk into next. It is a cold room, quiet, lit by small windows set high in stone walls, and the men sitting inside it are doing something that requires extraordinary skill, extraordinary patience, and a level of physical endurance that would make most of us put down our pens after 20 minutes. They are keeping the knowledge of the ancient world alive, one agonizing letter at a time, and what it cost them, what it truly quietly cost them, is a story almost nobody tells. Picture the following scene, and I want you to hold it clearly in your mind. A stone room, long and narrow, high windows, not because the architects wanted the space to feel grand, but because high windows mean the maximum amount of natural light falls at the precise angle needed to illuminate a writing desk without creating glare. Positioned beneath those windows, 7 slanted wooden desks. On each desk a piece of animal skin scraped, stretched, chalked, smooth, pinned flat and waiting. Beside each desk a small vessel of ink, a sharpened quill, a pumice stone for correcting errors, and a monk bent forward at a careful angle, arm moving in slow deliberate strokes across the page, writing by hand a text that may be centuries older than the monastery itself. It is winter. The room is cold. There is no fire because a fire near parchment and ink is an unacceptable risk, and the monk cannot wear gloves because gloves would ruin the precision of his grip. He has been sitting like this since shortly after sunrise. He will continue until the light fails entirely. This is the scriptorum, and what happened inside it is without any exaggeration one of the most consequential acts of intellectual preservation in the history of human civilization. The word itself is Latin scriptorium, meaning simply a place for writing, but that plain description does nothing to convey what these rooms actually were or what they cost the men who worked inside them. Let me start with the materials, because understanding what the monks were working with changes how you see the whole enterprise. The surface they wrote on was not paper, Paper was considered a foreign pagan technology associated with the Arab world and dismissed as fragile and unworthy of sacred text. Instead, monks wrote on parchment and vellum animal skin, specifically the skin of sheep, goats, and calves processed through a laborious and genuinely unpleasant sequence of steps. The hide was first soaked in a vat of water, often mixed with urine to loosen the hair, then stretched on a wooden frame, then scraped repeatedly with a curved knife curved specifically to reduce the risk of accidentally puncturing the skin until the surface was smooth enough to hold ink, then bleached with lime, then chalked. The best vellum came from calf skin. The very finest of all came from the skin of unborn animals. It was soft, almost translucent, and so expensive that it was reserved exclusively for the most important texts, copies of the Gospels, gifts for kings, the centerpiece manuscripts of a great monastery's collection. A single large Bible copied onto high-quality vellum required the skins of somewhere between 150 and 200 animals, one book, 200 sheep or calves, before a single word was written. Now consider what was written on that surface and how. The ink was made from oak galls, small spherical growths that appear on oak trees when wasps lay their eggs inside them, combined with iron sulfate, gum, arabic, and water. The mixture, when fresh, was a kind of blue-grey. It darkened to near black as it dried. A scribe would test his ink before beginning, and the marginalia of surviving manuscripts contain a small number of ink trials that are oddly touching tiny words scratched in the corner of a page just to feel the flow before committing to the real thing. The quill pen was made from a primary flight feather, most often from a goose, occasionally from a peacock, a crow, or an eagle. The feathers themselves were usually stripped away, leaving just the hollow shaft. The tip was cut into a precise point with a small knife, the same knife that later gave us the word penknife, and a slit made in the nib to control the flow of ink. A good scribe might go through several quills in a single day of work, and the work itself, the actual copying, is something I want you to understand physically, not just conceptually. A scribe did not simply read and write the way we read and write. Silent reading was not yet common in the early medieval period. A monk copying a manuscript would read the text aloud to himself quietly, sub voce, lips moving sound, barely escaping, then write what he had just spoken. The scriptorium was therefore not a silent room in the modern sense. It was filled with a low, continuous murmur, many men simultaneously dictating to themselves in near whispers. Word division as we know it, the spaces between words that make reading feel effortless, did not become standardized until the 9th and 10th centuries, which meant that earlier manuscripts had to be sounded out syllable by syllable to distinguish one word from the next. A skilled monk was expected to work for approximately 6 hours a day. That was the standard, but the best scribes, the ones whose hands were finest and whose eyes were sharpest, were sometimes excused from prayer services so they could work longer while the light lasted. Cassiodorus, the Roman statesman turned monk who founded the monastery of Vivarium in southern Italy around the year 544, explicitly granted his finest scribes exemption from the canonical hours, giving them instead a clock and an extra allocation of candles so they could continue working past sunset. When you consider how sacred the canonical hours were, how every other aspect of monastery life was organized around them, this exemption tells you precisely how valuable the scriptorium's output was considered. And now I want to tell you something that most histories leave out because it does not fit neatly into the narrative of noble self-sacrifice and civilizational preservation. It was miserable. Genuinely, physically, psychologically miserable. And the monks themselves said so. They left the evidence in the margins of the very manuscripts they were creating. In the narrow borders of parchment pages across Europe, in handwriting pressed between lines of carefully copied scripture, historians have found hundreds of small rebellions, tiny personal annotations that the scribes added, when the supervisor was not watching, or sometimes even when he was. These notes, known as colophons and marginalia, give us something extraordinarily rare in medieval historical study: the unfiltered inner voice of an ordinary person. One monk somewhere in cold northern Europe pressed his pen to the page at the end of a difficult session and wrote. While I wrote, I froze, and what I could not write by the beams of the sun I finished by candlelight. Another encountering poor quality materials left this note for posterity. The ink is thin, the vellum is defective, the day is dark. Do not blame me for the script. Another, apparently at the absolute limit of his patience, wrote simply, "Oh my hand." And another, completing what sounds like a particularly long and tedious text, "St. Patrick of Armagh, deliver me from writing." My personal favourite, and this was left at the end of a copy of a work by Thomas Aquinas, which gives it a certain ironic weight, reads, "The work is finished very long, very verbose and very tedious for the scribe. Thank God, and again thank God, there is one that I keep coming back to, written by a monk somewhere in the 8th century. It reads, 'He who does not know how to write does not think that it is a labour. 3 fingers write, but the whole body labours.' And then, in what I find one of the most human gestures in all of medieval history, he adds, 'Whoever has read this book, pray for me. 3 fingers write, the whole body labours.' The physical toll of this work was real and well documented. Scribes worked in contorted positions, bent forward over slanted desks, necks craned downward, right arm extended at a fixed angle for hours on end. Arthritis was common. Eye strain was endemic. The combination of cold immobility and the particular stress of fine motor work for extended periods produced chronic pain in the hands, neck, and back. One anonymous scribe in a manuscript that has survived to the present day left a longer complaint than most. He wrote, and I am rendering this as it comes to us from the original, that writing is excessive drudgery. It bends your back, it dims your sight, it breaks the stomach and the ribs, and it fills the kidneys with pain. He then asks the reader, whoever they may be, to turn the pages slowly and to keep their fingers away from the writing, because he says just as a hailstorm ruins the fertility of the soil, a careless reader destroys both the book and the writing. And then, almost like a sigh, for as the last port is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line welcome to the scribe. There is something in that sentence that genuinely moves me every time I encounter it. The sailor and the last port. After months at sea, cold, uncertain, far from everything familiar, the harbour finally appearing on the horizon. That is what the end of a manuscript felt like to the man who had spent weeks or months bent over it. Beyond the physical suffering, there was something else. Something the medieval church actually had a name for. Acedia. The word is Greek in origin, a compound of a meaning without and kaidos meaning care. It was counted among the great spiritual dangers of the monastic life. The earliest desert fathers had written about it. John Cassian, a monk and theologian who described monastic vices in the early 5th century, called it the noonday demon, an affliction that struck most powerfully in the middle of the day, when the hours stretched out interminably, when the sun seemed impossibly slow in its movement across the sky, and when the monk at his desk felt a creeping emptiness, a heaviness, a sense that nothing he did had meaning, and nothing would ever change. We would call it depression, possibly clinical depression in some of its more severe forms. It was considered a spiritual failure, a lack of trust in God, a surrender to distraction and worldly care. But reading the descriptions carefully, what you see is not laziness or faithlessness. What you see is the predictable psychological consequence of extended isolation, silence, repetitive work, and near total sensory deprivation in a cold room. The symptom that the ancient writers described most vividly, the feeling that the sun is moving too slowly, is almost clinically precise as a description of what we would today recognize as a mood disorder, with its characteristic distortion of subjective time. The monasteries developed responses to acedia prayer, of course, but also manual work, communal activity, and the structure of the canonical hours which forced a monk out of the scriptorium at regular intervals to sing with his brothers. Whether this was effective treatment in the clinical sense is impossible to know, but it is striking that the structure of the monastic day, which might look from the outside like nothing more than a cage of obligations, was also partly a deliberate protection against the specific kind of psychological deterioration that their particular lifestyle made possible, and yet they kept going. Generation after generation after generation, in cold rooms across France and England and Germany and Ireland and Italy, monks sat at their slanted desks and copied. They copied the Bible, they copied the letters of the Church Fathers, they copied Jerome's Latin translation of the Scriptures known as the Vulgate, and the commentaries of Augustine and Gregory, and critically they copied the ancient writers Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Pliny, and above all Aristotle, whose works might otherwise have been lost to the Latin West entirely. I want to give you one specific example that I think illustrates the magnitude of this work more vividly than any generalization can. In the scriptorium of the Monastery of Lindisfarne, a tiny island off the northeastern coast of England battered by North Sea winds, a monk named Edfrith began work on a manuscript sometime around the year 700. The text was the 4 Gospels copied in Latin from an Italian original. But Edfrith did not simply copy the words, he illuminated them. He decorated each opening page with designs of astonishing complexity, interlaced animals and figures, geometric spirals, patterns of such microscopic intricacy that modern scholars examining them with magnifying glasses have discovered details invisible to the naked eye that are nonetheless perfectly executed. The Lindisfarne Gospels, as the manuscript is now known, contains pages where the density of the decoration is so extreme that researchers have calculated Edfrith must have spent months, possibly years, on certain individual pages. The entire manuscript took an estimated 10 years to complete. 10 years, one man, one book, and then, because nothing in medieval history is without its complications, the manuscript was carried by monks fleeing Viking raids, transported across England for years, nearly lost in a storm when it fell overboard from a boat, and was miraculously recovered, washed up on a beach, and eventually came to rest in a library where 12 centuries later you can still go and look at it. What does it mean that these things survived? I have thought about this question for a long time, and I keep arriving at the same unsatisfying but honest answer. It is a near miracle of probability. The Viking raids destroyed monasteries across northern Europe. The Norman invasions transformed English ecclesiastical culture. Fires, floods, wars, simple neglect. The list of things that could have and did destroy manuscripts is staggering. Scholars have calculated that for every text from classical antiquity that we possess today, perhaps dozens of others vanished forever. We have Virgil, but we have lost hundreds of Roman poets whose names we know only because another surviving writer mentioned them in passing. The ones that survived because monks in cold, painful, psychologically demanding rooms kept copying them, because they believed, and this is the part that I find both moving and slightly baffling, that the act of writing itself was a form of prayer. One 12th century writer argued that a scribe who copies sacred text is preaching with his fingers, that every letter formed correctly is a wound against the devil, that the harder the work, the greater the spiritual merit. A 6th century monastic rule put it with beautiful bluntness: he who does not turn up the earth with the plough ought to write the parchment with his fingers. Work as prayer, prayer as work. The two made indistinguishable by cold and discipline, and the slow scratch of quill on skin. There is a question I genuinely wrestle with when I think about this chapter of the story, and I want to share it with you because I think it deserves more than a tidy answer. We celebrate the scriptorium as the place where Western civilization was saved, and that is largely true. Without those monks and their cracked fingers and their dim light and their acedia and their small furious notes in the margins, without all of that, the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world would have been far more fragmentary than it already is. But here is what I also sit with. The monks did not preserve everything equally. They chose. The armarius, the director of the scriptorium, decided what was copied and what was set aside. Pagan texts that seemed useful were copied alongside scripture. Those that seemed dangerous were not. Entire categories of ancient knowledge were filtered through a religious lens that determined their survival or their disappearance. We received the ancient world that the medieval church decided we should receive. That is not a condemnation, it is simply an honest acknowledgement of how history actually works. Knowledge does not preserve itself. It is preserved by people with all of their judgments and priorities and fears and limitations. The monks who saved Virgil from oblivion were the same people who decided other things were not worth saving. And some of those other things are gone now past recovery, their absence a kind of permanent silence in the record of human thought. All of that happened in rooms that were cold and dim and inadequately heated. And cold, it turns out, was only one of the bodily hardships that defined life inside those walls. Because what the scriptorium did to a monk's mind and fingers and posture was really only a small portion of what the monastic life asked of the human body. The sleeping arrangements alone, the temperature, the timing, the hard surfaces constitute their own complete story, and it is a story that might make you genuinely grateful for your mattress tonight. That is exactly where we're going next. That cold room in the scriptorium, the one where monks sat for 6 hours with cracked fingers and aching backs and whispered complaints pressed into the margins of manuscripts, was actually, by the standards of daily monastic life, one of the more comfortable places in the building. I realize that sounds difficult to believe, so let me take you somewhere else. Let me take you to the dormitory at 2 o'clock in the morning. The dormitory, the daughter in the language of the cloister, was typically a long stone room on the upper floor of the east wing of the monastery complex. It was positioned there deliberately, with the staircase descending directly into the south transept of the church, so that the monks could move from bed to choir stalls in the minimum possible number of steps, with the minimum possible delay the moment the bell rang. The room was not heated. This was not an oversight, and it was not simply a question of unavailable technology. Heating was available, the kitchen had a permanent fire, the warming house had a hearth. The dormitory did not have one because the dormitory was meant to be cold. The discomfort was part of the design. What you slept on was a straw mattress. Above you was a wool blanket, sometimes two. Benedict's rule prescribed a mattress, a blanket, a coverlet, and a pillow, specific, modest, sufficient for survival. Not comfortable by any interpretation of the word that would have meant anything to the men who slept in the great houses of the surrounding countryside. And here is the detail I keep returning to because it captures the whole philosophy in a single image: you slept in your clothes. Chapter 22 of the Rule of St. Benedict instructed explicitly that monks should sleep clothed and girded, belted or corded at the waist habit and tunic on ready to rise without dressing. The stated reasoning was twofold: modesty and efficiency. When the bell rang for matins at 2 in the morning, a monk who had to pull on his habit lost precious minutes. A monk already wearing it simply rose, tightened his belt and walked to the church. There was no undressing at bedtime, no washing before sleep. You lay down in the same wool garment you had worn all day, pulled the blanket over yourself, and that was it until the bell. Let me ask you something, because I am genuinely curious what your reaction is to this. Does sleeping in your clothes sound terrible to you, or does it sound like a reasonable accommodation given the circumstances? Cold room interrupted sleep need for quick response to the bell? I've asked people this question before, and the answers tend to split along unexpected lines. Some people find the clothing detail the most disturbing thing in the whole monastic regimen. Others find it oddly practical. Both reactions are correct. The monastic dormitory held both qualities simultaneously. It was genuinely harsh, and it was also rationally engineered for the specific demands of the life being lived inside it. What makes it extraordinary is that the harshness was not incidental. It was chosen. It was the point. The monk Raoul Glaber, who lived and wrote in the 11th century, left behind a passage that I find startlingly intimate for its era. He described being visited on one of those 2 a.m. risings by what he called a demon. The demon's message was gentle and practical. It whispered to him something like this: "I wonder why you are so eager to jump out of bed the moment you hear the signal and to interrupt the sweet rest of sleep when you could simply stay here until the 3rd bell. The 3rd bell was considerably later." Raoul Glaber knew this. He also knew and recorded the fact, apparently to illustrate his own spiritual weakness, that the argument the demon made was not entirely without merit. The sweet rest of sleep. That phrase from a monk in a cold stone room at 2 a.m. tells you something real about the nature of the life. He got up anyway. That is the whole story in miniature. The pull toward rest and the discipline that overcame it happening in a man's chest in the dark every single morning for his entire monastic life. The dormitory itself was a carefully governed space. Monks were not permitted to light candles at night. Fire was an unacceptable risk to the building and to the manuscripts stored nearby. One monk a monk called the circuitor patrolled the buildings at night. His duties included checking that no illicit candles were burning, that no monks were engaged in any prohibited activity. And this detail has stayed with me because it is so unexpectedly specific that no monk had fallen asleep in the latrine block. That last duty apparently needed to be specified. It tells you something about how exhausted these men were, and what corners of the monastery could be found in the small hours of the night quietly dark enough, and still enough that a man might sit down and close his eyes and not open them again until the circator found him. The latrine block at Canterbury Cathedral Priory, one of the most famous and prosperous monastic houses in England, could accommodate 55 monks simultaneously. This is architecturally an impressive commitment to sanitary provision. It is also, when you think about what the circuitor was looking for in there, a somewhat melancholy detail. The sleeping arrangements were only one of several dimensions of physical discomfort that were deliberately structured into the monastic life. And I want to spend some time on this because I think the deliberateness is what the modern imagination most consistently fails to absorb. We tend to read accounts of medieval hardship and categorize it as privation, as suffering that existed because the technology or resources to eliminate it were not available, and in many aspects of medieval life that is accurate. Poor people in the Middle Ages were cold and hungry and ill-clothed because they lacked the means to be otherwise. Poverty was not a choice for them. The monastic version was different in kind. The historian Scott Bruce, writing about the culture of Cluniac monasticism, makes a point that I think is essential. The deliberate discomforts of monastic life, the cold dormitory, the rough clothing, the interrupted sleep, the austere diet were explicitly designed as a rejection of comfort which only made sense as a rejection if comfort was otherwise available to you. In other words, the monastic hardship was primarily meaningful to people who could have chosen warmth and softness and ease and had declined it, which meant it was primarily meaningful practically and theologically to the upper-class monks who arrived with the experience of feather beds and heated chambers and fine linen behind them. This is not speculation. It was said directly at the time. The reasoning was explicit. A poor man who entered a monastery and slept on a straw mattress in a cold room had merely exchanged one form of discomfort for another. He gained less spiritual credit from the sacrifice, because the sacrifice cost him less. The men who gained the full spiritual value of monastic austerity were the men who had genuinely left something behind to get there. The rough wool habit that a nobleman's son wore in the cloister was in that context both a garment and a statement. It said I could be wearing something else. I choose not to. Speaking of which, let me tell you about what they actually wore. Because the clothing of the medieval monk is one of the more instructive case studies in deliberate discomfort that this whole story offers. The basic monastic habit was a tunic of rough, undyed wool tied at the waist with a leather belt or cord. Over it the cowl, a long sleeveless outer garment with a deep hood covering the body from shoulder to ankle. The Cistercians, as was their custom in everything, took this further. Their habits were made from completely undyed fleece, giving them the off-white colour that earned them the name white monks. The Carthusians went further still, wearing hair shirts next to the skin on certain penitential occasions. Hair shirts, I want to dwell on this for a moment because it sounds medieval in the most extreme sense. But it was real, it was documented, and it was chosen. A hair shirt was exactly what it sounds like. A garment woven from coarse animal hair worn against the skin rough enough to cause constant low-level irritation and chafing. It was not meant to be comfortable, it was meant to hurt. Not badly enough to incapacitate, but enough that you were continuously aware of your body's discomfort, which was the point it prevented the kind of settled bodily ease that was considered dangerous to the soul. The most famous hair shirt in English history belonged to Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was killed in his own cathedral in the year 1170. When the monks prepared his body for burial, they discovered that beneath his magnificent archiepiscopal vestments, the rich cloth and embroidery appropriate to the highest ecclesiastical rank in England, he was wearing a hair shirt. And it was the record notes full of lice. That detail is historically documented and consistently reported. It was not incidental. The lice were understood by the theology of the time to be part of the penitential value of the garment. If you were going to mortify your flesh as a reminder of human frailty, the lice were doing their job. I am aware that this sounds extreme. I think it was extreme. I also think that it represents in its most concentrated form the same logic that governed the cold dormitory and the straw mattress, and the rough wool. The body is not to be made comfortable. The body's comfort is not the point. The body is a vehicle for something else, and the vehicle is not supposed to enjoy the journey. There was another practice, regular, scheduled, institutionalized, that further shaped the physical experience of monastic life: bloodletting. Not as a response to illness, but as a prophylactic measure. The monastic customaries, the working guides that detailed exactly how each aspect of monastery life was to be conducted, devoted entire chapters to bloodletting as a standard procedure for healthy monks. The practice was performed on a rotating schedule several times a year. A monk would have a quantity of blood removed typically by cutting a vein in the arm, then be given a few days of rest and additional food to recover before returning to full duties. The theological justification was humoral. Removing blood maintained the balance of the body's humours, reduced the heat of physical desire, and kept the monk's constitution in the optimal state for sustained religious practice. The spiritual justification was almost more striking. Bloodletting was understood in at least one monastic customary as a form of imitating Christ, who had been bled during the Passion. To bleed voluntarily was to participate in a modest physical way in the suffering of the figure you were trying to serve. The routine was carefully regulated. Bloodletting was not permitted during Advent, during harvest season, when labour demands were highest, or when a monk was already ill. It was exclusively for the healthy. And afterward the monk was given 3 days in the infirmary rest warmth special food, including meat, which, given the general austerity of daily monastic life, made the post-bloodletting period something that monks apparently looked forward to as one of the more comfortable interludes in an otherwise austere year. The infirmary was warm. The infirmary had fires. The infirmary allowed meat that was otherwise prohibited. A monk recovering from bloodletting got to sleep somewhere comfortable, eat something satisfying, and rest without obligation for 3 days. I say this not to be cynical about the bloodletting, which while medically ineffective was genuinely believed in and genuinely practiced, but to note what it reveals about the baseline. The infirmary was a relief because the ordinary daily life was genuinely hard. The monks were not performing hardship for an audience. The straw mattress was actually scratchy. The cold room was actually cold. And the periodic relief of warmth and rest and better food was genuinely welcome. One more layer of this story that I want to place before you before we move on, because it seems to me the most philosophically interesting of all. Earlier I described something that the Cistercian novices were told to practice each night before sleeping, comparing their bed to a grave lying down as though for the last time. I want to return to that image now because it was not limited to the Cistercians. It was a principle woven through the entire tradition of monastic life. The monk Stephen of Sawley, writing in the 12th century, left a specific instruction for his community. When you go to bed, he wrote, look at your coarse woolen blanket and bed covers, and compare your bed to the grave just as if you were entering it for burial. Then if you can sleep, all is well. If you cannot, he noted with charming practicality experience, has shown that reciting the Athanasian Creed 7 times or the 7 penitential psalms will send you to sleep. The theology and the practical sleep hygiene advice coexisting in a single paragraph. The grave comparison and the insomnia remedy in the same sentence. This is, I think, exactly the texture of medieval monastic life, as it was actually lived simultaneously lofty in spiritual aspiration and rooted in the completely ordinary human problem of lying awake in the dark. The body under siege, sleep-interrupted warmth, withheld clothing, rough blood periodically let, and through all of it every morning the same question that Raoul Glaber's demon posed, why are you getting up, why not stay? And every morning the answer that the life required because the bell rang, because this was chosen, because the discomfort paradoxically was the point. Now here is the part that I think is genuinely strange and where this chapter of the story makes an unexpected turn. All of that hardship, the straw, the cold, the wool, the early mornings, was experienced by men who as individuals owned nothing. They had surrendered everything on entry. Their clothes were not theirs. Their beds were not theirs. The knife for sharpening their quill, the comb they used, the handkerchief, all of it belonged to the community, not the person. And yet the institution that housed all those individually poor monks was in many cases one of the wealthiest entities in medieval Europe. The monk was genuinely structurally legally poor. The monastery was astonishingly, sometimes scandalously, inarguably rich. That paradox, the bare feet on cold stone and the vast landholdings, the straw mattress and the Cluny treasury, the rough wool and the abbey church larger than any cathedral in Christendom, that is exactly where we are going next. Right. Stop for a moment and consider this paradox. The men who lived inside those walls took a vow of poverty at the moment they entered. They were not permitted to own property. They could not carry money. The clothes on their backs, the sandals on their feet, the straw mat they slept on, none of it belonged to them personally. If a monk received a gift from a visiting family member without the abbot's permission, he could be disciplined. If he secretly kept even a small personal object, a keepsake, a coin, a handwritten letter, he was in violation of everything he had sworn to uphold. The individual monk was by every measurable standard poor. And yet, by the 12th century, the institution that monk called home was in many parts of Europe the single wealthiest entity in the known world, wealthier in terms of land holding and economic output than the kings and dukes who nominally governed the surrounding countryside. wealthier than entire cities. The monasteries owned the mills that ground the grain every family in the region depended on. They owned the fish ponds, the vineyards, the forests. They collected rent from hundreds of tenant farmers who worked their land. They received donations from dying nobles who wanted prayers said for their souls. They were exempt from most taxes, and they never had to divide their holdings among heirs, because an institution does not die, does not marry, does not produce children. The monastery simply accumulated, generation after generation, century after century. And nowhere in medieval Europe was this accumulation more spectacular, more visible or more consequential than at a place called Cluny. Cluny Abbey stands, or rather stood, since most of it is now rubble and memory in the Burgundy region of France. It was founded in the year 910 by a Benedictine monk named Berno, with the patronage of William I, Duke of Aquitaine. And from the very beginning, Cluny had something that very few other monasteries possessed: genuine independence. The deed of foundation was unusual in medieval terms. William donated the land, and then, in a move that reads almost like a legal masterstroke, he released Cluny from all future obligations to himself and his family, except for their prayers for his soul. The monastery would answer not to any local bishop, not to any regional lord, but only to the Pope in Rome. And crucially, the Pope was across the Alps in Italy, which meant that in practical daily terms Cluny answered to essentially no one. No secular lord could install his relatives as abbot. No bishop could redirect its income. No king could sequester its assets. This structural freedom, combined with the genuine commitment to rigorous monastic observance, made Cluny enormously attractive to wealthy patrons across Europe. When a nobleman wanted to ensure that prayers would be said for his soul in perpetuity by a respected and independent community, Cluny was the obvious choice, and so the donations flowed: land villages, vineyards, mills, forests, serfs, from the Holy Roman Empire, from the Spanish kingdoms, from southern England, from Italy. By the 12th century, at the absolute zenith of its power, the Cluniac network controlled more than 1,000 dependent houses spread across Europe, from Poland to Scotland to the edges of the Iberian Peninsula. Those houses together claimed around 10,000 members. Every one of them answered ultimately to the Abbot of Cluny. By the 14th century, that number had grown to over 1,450 foundations, an organization larger than most modern multinational corporations, stretching across what is now a dozen countries governed by a single man sitting in Burgundy. Think about that organizational structure for a moment. 1,450 institutions, 10,000 monks, all coordinated, all sending a portion of their income to the mother house, all receiving visits from abbatial inspectors, all meeting at Cluny once a year for the great annual chapter. This was not a loosely affiliated community of like-minded people. This was an empire, and the physical expression of that empire was breathtaking. The third and final abbey church at Cluny, known to historians as Cluny III, was begun in the year 1088 under Abbot Hugh of Semur, one of the great builders of the medieval world. When it was completed roughly 40 years later, it was the largest church in Christendom, not the largest monastic church, not the largest church in France, the largest church anywhere in the known Christian world, 187 meters long, 30 meters from floor to vault, 5 naves, 2 transepts, 12 chapels in the apse, 6 bell towers, the barrel-vaulted ceiling soaring above the nave at a height specifically calculated to be acoustically optimal for the Cluniac liturgy of continuous sung prayer, financed not by local fundraising but by the donations of kings Alfonso VI of Castile, William the Conqueror's son William Rufus of England, who competed for the spiritual prestige of contributing to the most significant building project of their era. Pope Urban II, who had himself been a novice and later prior at Cluny consecrated 5 of its altars in the year 1095, while the church was still under construction, and announced publicly that Cluny surpassed all other monasteries, even the most ancient, in honour and religion. That is an extraordinary endorsement, and it came from the man who just a few weeks earlier had launched the first crusade from the Council of Clermont, the most powerful religious figure in the world, standing in an unfinished monastery church in Burgundy and declaring it the greatest in existence. Cluny III held that distinction, the largest church in Christendom, for nearly 4 centuries. Nothing surpassed it until St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was completed in the 16th century. Have you ever stood inside a great cathedral and felt genuinely small? Now try to imagine a building larger than most cathedrals of the era, built not for a city's congregation, but for the daily liturgy of a few hundred monks. The scale alone communicates something about the ambition of what Cluny had become, but Cluny, extraordinary as it was in many ways simply the most extreme example of a pattern that repeated itself across European monasticism at every scale. A monastery was in essence a self-contained economic organism. A large one, say a Benedictine abbey in England with 100 monks, would typically own the mills that processed the grain of every tenant farm within reach. This was not a minor matter. In the medieval economy, access to a working mill was not optional. Without it, grain could not be ground into flour, and without flour there was no bread, and without bread there was no survival. The monastery charged fees for use of its mills. It leased its fish ponds to local fishermen. It managed extensive woodlands which provided not just timber, but charcoal hunting rights and the raw materials for construction. It ran bakeries, breweries, tanneries, and guest houses. It operated in effect as the dominant economic actor in its entire region. The financial accounts that survive from larger English monasteries are remarkably detailed and remarkably illuminating. The records from Worcester Cathedral Priory show that the monastery managed not just its 40 to 50 resident monks, but also a household of servants and staff, roughly double that number, plus visiting dignitaries, permanent pensioners known as corodis, who'd essentially purchased lifetime room and board and the daily distribution of food to the poor who gathered at the priory gate. In a single recorded year during the 15th century, the prior of Worcester spent what amounted to the annual salary of a well-paid parish priest on wine and hospitality for a single visit from the Duke of Clarence, brother of King Edward IV. That is what monastic hospitality looked like at the upper end of the scale. Red wine, white wine, distinguished guests, a prior with his own household steward, and a personal budget that dwarfed anything an ordinary clergyman could imagine. The engine behind all of this was land, specifically the medieval system of manorial estates. In the feudal organization of European society, land was the fundamental unit of wealth and power. A manor, the smallest viable estate, might cover a few hundred acres and support the income of one noble family. A monastery, by contrast, could hold dozens or even hundreds of manors scattered across entire regions, each sending rents and agricultural produce to the central house. English monasteries at their height were, as one historian has put it with studied understatement, the wealthiest landowners in the country, more so than any English king. The mechanism that produced this wealth was both systematic and continuous. When a wealthy person died in the medieval world, one of the most common provisions of their will was a donation of land or money to a monastery in exchange for prayers for their soul. The theology was straightforward. Purgatory was real, the soul needed intercession, and a community of holy men praying in perpetuity was the most reliable investment a person could make in their own salvation. The monastery received the land, the donor received the prayers, and since the monastery, unlike a family, never died, never subdivided its holdings between heirs, never went bankrupt through bad marriages, never had its estate scattered by conquest. The accumulation simply never stopped. Kings and popes were aware of this dynamic and occasionally uneasy about it. When Henry VIII's agents undertook the famous Valor Ecclesiasticus in 1535, a comprehensive survey of ecclesiastical wealth in England, what they found was staggering. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England alone, around 12,000 people in religious orders, monks, nuns, canons, friars. The combined assets of English monasteries when dissolved generated roughly £1.33 million for the crown, a sum so enormous that even Henry, who spent it with notable speed on military campaigns and building projects, was briefly the wealthiest monarch in English history. 1 man in 50 among the adult male population of England was in religious orders. 1 institution in 50 was collectively worth as much as the entire rest of the English nobility combined. Now I want to pause here because I think this is the moment where an honest reckoning with the monastery's place in medieval society gets complicated in a way that the simple narratives either monasteries were corrupt and wealthy or monasteries were holy and essential tend to miss. The wealth was real. The land accumulation was real. There are well-documented cases of abbots who lived essentially as secular lords, hunting, entertaining, travelling with large retinues, sitting in parliament, alongside earls and barons. The abbot of a major monastery ranked in the eyes of the English state alongside the most powerful secular magnates in the kingdom. He had a seat in the House of Lords. He could be called to advise the king. He had the right and duty to hold court over the tenants of his manors. The peasants who worked monastic land were not necessarily better treated than those who worked under secular lords. Some monasteries were famously harsh landlords. The monks of St. Albans in England had such a contentious relationship with the townspeople over their monopoly on grain mills that it became a recurring source of serious conflict across several generations. When the peasants' revolt erupted in 1381, attacks on monastic property were not incidental, they were targeted. The townsfolk of St. Albans marched on the abbey with particular fury, demanding the return of millstones that the monks had decades earlier confiscated from households that had tried to grind their own grain. Millstones. The monks had literally taken the millstones from people's homes to enforce their grinding monopoly, and then had the paving stones of the monastery courtyard decorated with them as a deliberate display of power. When the rebels arrived in 1381, they dug up those paving stones and distributed pieces to the crowd as symbols of reclaimed dignity. I find that image unforgettable. The monastery paved its courtyard with the proof of its dominance, and the people, when they finally had the chance, tore it apart with their hands. But here is the complication that I keep returning to, because intellectual honesty requires it. The same monasteries that were large landlords were also in almost every case the primary providers of social services in their regions. Medieval hospitals did not exist as secular institutions. Schools for the children of common people did not exist as secular institutions. Safe lodging for travellers, food for the destitute poor who appeared daily at monastery gates, basic medical care for the sick who had nowhere else to turn, all of this flowed from the monastery's resources. The wealth that irritated critics and provoked peasant fury was also the wealth that made those services possible. One historian looking at the aggregate has argued that the famous claim that the Church controlled 1/3 of the wealth of medieval Europe is technically misleading. What it actually means is that roughly 1/3 of the surplus value produced by European agriculture flowed into institutions, hospitals, schools, bridges, guest houses, libraries, poor relief, that served the public rather than enriching private individuals. The monk in his stone cell was genuinely poor. The beggar at the monastery gate was genuinely fed. But the institution between them was genuinely powerful, and power that goes unaccountable tends in every era to find ways to serve itself. The Cistercians understood this. It was precisely the corrupting effect of wealth, the slow gravitational pull of comfort and influence, that drove Robert of Molesme and his companions to found a new order at Citeaux in the year 1098, specifically as a correction to what Benedictine prosperity had become. They chose the wilderness deliberately. They built in stone without decoration. They refused donations of serfs and relied on their own labour. They wore undyed wool, which is why they were known as the white monks, in contrast to the black monks of the Benedictine houses. For a generation, the Cistercian experiment was extraordinary. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most electrifying personalities of the 12th century, a man whose preaching could fill a town square and whose letters could move kings, joined the order in the year 1112 at the age of around 22, and brought 30 relatives and friends with him. Within 40 years of its founding, there were 350 Cistercian abbeys across Europe, and then, almost as if by some law of institutional physics, they began to accumulate land. By the late Middle Ages, the Cistercians were among the largest wool producers in England, their sheep grazing on vast upland estates that had been donated to them by nobles who admired their austerity. The circle was complete. All of this, the land, the power, the wealth, the architecture, the politics, raises a question that I think is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. What was it actually for? Not in theory, not in theology, not in the official justifications, but in practice, in the daily lived reality of all those acres and all those rents and all those millstones embedded in courtyards as trophies. I don't think there is one clean answer. The monastery was simultaneously and genuinely all of the following things: a place of sincere prayer and scholarship, a sophisticated economic machine extracting value from the land, a social safety net for the poor and the sick, a vehicle for the ambitions of abbots who had as much in common with secular lords as with desert hermits, and a living repository of the belief that the boundary between heaven and earth was thinner inside those walls than anywhere else. It held all of those contradictions at once for centuries without resolution, which is, I suppose, a very human thing to do. The monastery as an empire had its parallel story running alongside all of this, a story of what it looked like when that power went wrong. Not just in terms of corruption or excess, but in terms of genuine institutional darkness, the abbots who ruled like tyrants, the financial scandals, the scandals of other kinds entirely, the politics and the bribery and the compromises that accumulated like sediment in the foundations of institutions that had been standing for centuries. That story, the one about what happened behind closed doors when the bell rang and the gates were locked for the night, is where we are headed now, and it is more uncomfortable and more human than anything we have covered so far. Something I have been sitting with through all of this, through the wealth, the land holdings, the political power, the abbots who sat in Parliament alongside earls, is a question that I think the history invites, but rarely answers directly. What did all that wealth actually do? Not in the sense of enriching specific individuals, which it certainly did in some cases, but in terms of daily practical life-changing impact on the people who lived within reach of a monastery's walls. What did those accumulated resources actually produce that could not have existed without them? One answer involves illuminated manuscripts and beer and preserved Latin. We have already been there. But there is another answer that I think is even more quietly extraordinary, and it connects directly to the place we visited briefly at the end of our time in the dormitory, the one warm room in an otherwise cold monastery, the one space where monks were given rest and meat and fire, the infirmary. Let me give you an image to hold, because images are how this becomes real rather than abstract. The year's around 825. A monk scholar named Reginald is sitting at a large desk in the library of a monastery in what is now Switzerland. Before him is a sheet of parchment that he's been working on for months. It is a detailed labelled architectural drawing of an idealised Benedictine monastery, addressed to the Abbot Gosbert of St. Gall, as a guide for building. This document, known today as the Plan of St. Gall, is the largest surviving architectural drawing from the entire early medieval period. It has been preserved in the library at St. Gallen for 12 centuries, and modern scholars have spent generations analysing every labelled room, every courtyard, every garden bed. What they find when they look carefully tells you almost everything important about how the medieval monastery understood its own purpose. At the centre of the complex, the church and the cloister, expected, but radiating outward from that spiritual core interwoven with the kitchen and the bakehouse and the scriptorium and the granary, is something that no other institution of the era could have offered a fully integrated medical campus. There is a house for the physician. Adjacent to it, connected by a short covered walkway, a dedicated bloodletting facility, not just a room but a building equipped with a central hearth and 4 corner fireplaces so that patients weakened by the procedure could be kept genuinely warm. Beyond that, an infirmary with beds, its own small refectory, its own chapel, its own latrine, and immediately outside the infirmary's south wall positioned so that a practitioner could step through a door and have a remedy in hand within seconds, a physic garden. The plan labels every bed of that garden. 16 rectangular raised plots, each devoted to a single medicinal species. Sage, rosemary, mint, fennel, rue, lovage, cumin, iris, whose dried roots were used for chest complaints, pepperwort, climbing beans, costmary, and rose and lily, which served both the infirmary and the altar, beauty and medicine occupying the same soil. That plan was never built exactly as drawn. No monastery was, but it describes the ideal that shaped hundreds of real buildings across medieval Europe. And the ideal is unambiguous. The care of the sick was not an afterthought, not a charitable extra, not a peripheral function. It was architecturally central, structurally deliberate, as important to the monastery's design as the church itself. The theological foundation for this was explicit. Chapter 36 of the Rule of St. Benedict: before all things and above all things, special care must be taken of the sick, so that they may be served as if they were Christ in person, not as if they were fellow monks, not as if they deserved decent treatment, as if they were Christ. The theological weight of that instruction is considerable. In the Benedictine understanding, the face looking up at you from the infirmary bed, pale, feverish, perhaps frightened, was not just a suffering human being. It was a specific opportunity to serve God directly in person, in the most literal sense the tradition allowed. This gave monastic medicine its peculiar combination of practical urgency and spiritual depth. The monk physician, who was also a contemplative man of prayer, did not experience the clinical and the devotional as separate activities. Preparing a poultice was as much an act of worship as singing vespers. Sitting with a dying man through the night was as much prayer as any psalm. And let us be precise about this, because the history supports it. The combination produced real results. Not always. Not by the standards of modern medicine, which would find medieval treatment almost entirely unrecognizable, but by the standards of the available alternatives, which were essentially nothing. The monastic infirmary was something remarkable. Who was the infirmarian? Not a physician in any sense we would recognize. The great medical schools, Salerno in southern Italy, which the Met Museum describes as having been founded by a Christian, an Arab and a Jew, and which was notably free of clerical control, began to emerge from the late 10th century onward. But for the 5 centuries before that, and in many regions long after, the most medically educated person within 100 miles was almost certainly a monk. He had access to classical texts. He had access to Galen and Hippocrates in Latin translation. The same monks who copied scripture also copied the ancient medical writers' understanding that preserving knowledge about the body was inseparable from caring for the souls housed within those bodies. He had access to Arabic medical knowledge that entered European medicine through monastic translation networks, especially from the 11th century onward as contact with the Islamic world increased. Hildegard of Bingen, the oblate child-turned-abbess, who composed more surviving medieval chants than any other composer in history, was also, as it happens, a medical writer of substantial sophistication. Her work on medicine and natural history, written in the 12th century, integrated humoral theory with specific herbal treatments and a remarkably detailed understanding of the human body. She's thought to have served as infirmarian in her own community, treating not only the nuns but pilgrims, workers, and the poor from the surrounding area. She wrote about diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis with a clinical directness that reflects genuine hands-on experience. She prescribed specific herbs for specific conditions. Some of those prescriptions, when analysed by modern pharmacologists, contain compounds that have measurable physiological effects. This is not coincidence. The monks and nuns who tended the physic gardens had centuries of accumulated empirical observation behind them. They knew from watching which plants helped with pain, and which with fever, and which with digestive distress. They did not know why in the biochemical sense, and their explanatory framework, the four humours, the balance of hot and cold and wet and dry, was entirely wrong. But observation is observation. When something worked, they kept doing it. When it did not, they tried something else. The process was slow and uneven and mixed with a great deal that did not work at all, but the direction of travel was genuine. I want to be specific about the herbs because the specificity is where the real story lives. The physic garden at St. Gall included sage, which contains compounds that modern research has confirmed affect memory and cognition, specifically the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is the same enzyme targeted by drugs currently used for Alzheimer's disease. It included fennel, which has real effects on digestion and is still used in herbal medicine today. It included rue, which was used for treating menstrual irregularity and has been confirmed to contain alkaloids with physiological activity, though at high doses it is also toxic. It included rosemary, whose antimicrobial properties are now well documented. The Sion Abbey Herbal, compiled at a Brigittine convent in England around the year 1517, catalogued over 700 herbal plants and more than 300 remedies. Archaeological excavations at the site of St. Mary Spital in London, an Augustinian hospital operating from the 12th century, recovered ceramic jars from what had been the pharmacy, their residues still detectable by chemical analysis. Hemp, opium poppy, rose, cedar, pine. Hemp and opium poppy are genuine analgesics. The monks were administering effective pain relief. They did not call it that, they called it cooling the heat of the humour or calming the excess. But the patient lying in the infirmary bed with a fractured leg who was given an infusion of opium poppy was having their pain genuinely reduced by a real pharmacological mechanism. And the infirmary garden served another function that was less obvious but equally practical. Monastic infirmaries used plants that produced what were called good smells, rose violet mint, in the specific belief that bad air carried disease, and that good fragrant air counteracted it. This was, of course, theoretically wrong. Miasma theory, the idea that disease spreads through bad odours, is incorrect, but the practical consequence of surrounding sick patients with lavender and rose and mint was that the infirmary smelled pleasant, the atmosphere was less oppressive, and the aromatic plants may have provided some genuine antibacterial benefit through their volatile oils. Wrong theory, partially useful outcome. Medieval medicine in a single example. Let me tell you what treatment at a monastic infirmary actually looked like on an ordinary day for an ordinary monk who had fallen ill. The infirmarier, the monk responsible for the infirmary, often one of the more senior and educated members of the community, examined the patient. This examination was more systematic than you might expect. Medieval clinical examination followed protocols derived from ancient texts: pulse urine inspection, examination of the skin and eyes. Urine inspection was taken so seriously that it generated its own genre of medical illustration images of a physician holding a flask of urine up to the light survive in dozens of medieval manuscripts, including some distinctly satirical ones, featuring monkeys in the same posture, which tells you something about how the practice was perceived by the general public. Based on this examination, the infirmary would determine the humoral imbalance and prescribe accordingly. A fever was likely an excess of blood which was hot and wet. Cooling herbs, mint, rose, violet would be prescribed. Rest, cooler food, and in many cases some form of purging either through laxative herbs or through bloodletting, which was understood to remove the hot excess. The patient would be moved to the infirmary proper, a warmer, more comfortable space than the ordinary dormitory. He would be given food that was prohibited in the refectory meat, richer, bread-warm broth. He would be excused from the divine office, though the infirmary had its own chapel, and prayers were said there so the bell of the canonical hours still reached him even in his bed. And someone would sit with him. This is the detail that the clinical description tends to skip over, but which the documentary evidence consistently emphasizes. The infirmary visited regularly. Other monks came. In Cistercian houses there are accounts of the entire community visiting a sick brother not to perform a medical function, but simply to be present. The rule was explicit that the sick should receive attention. Not institutional attention managed at arm's length, personal attention, human presence. Now the treatments that would strike you as bizarre are equally real and deserve honest acknowledgement. Alongside the herbal remedies and the clinical examination, the medieval infirmary offered another category of treatment, the spiritual. Sacred relics, holy water, the touching of a saint's tomb. These were not separate from medicine in the medieval understanding, they were part of the same continuum of care. The Canterbury water, the mixture of Thomas Becket's blood and holy water prepared by the monks of Christchurch Priory after his murder in 1170, was sold to pilgrims in small metal containers called ampulli and used, according to the records, as a treatment applied to afflicted body parts consumed orally or taken home for future use. The monks kept careful records of the healings attributed to it. These records, known as miracle collections, described specific cases: a paralyzed man who recovered after bathing in the water, a woman blind in one eye who regained her sight, a child burning with fever who was cooled. We cannot obviously reconstruct the medical explanation for any of these outcomes from this distance. Some were probably real recoveries from conditions that would have resolved anyway. Some were likely exaggerated or misremembered. Some may have involved the placebo effect, which is a genuine physiological phenomenon, and some in a handful of documented cases were probably fabricated by monks who understood that a reputation for miraculous healing brought pilgrims, and pilgrims brought donations. I say that last part not to be cynical about the religious sincerity of the monks involved, most of whom were genuinely faithful, but to be honest about the fact that the infirmary existed within the same institution we've been examining throughout this whole story, one capable simultaneously of extraordinary care and considerable self-interest. Let me give you one more specific image before we move forward, because it captures the full complexity of what monastic medicine actually was. The Benedictine monk Walafrid Strabo, who lived at the Monastery of Reichenau, on an island in Lake Constance in what is now Germany, wrote a long poem in the 9th century about the garden he tended there. The poem, known as the Hortulus, the Little Garden, is one of the most charming texts from the entire medieval period, and one of the most practically revealing. Walafrid describes each plant in his garden with genuine affection and specific medical precision. He writes of sage and its proven usefulness for human ailments. He writes of fennel's ability to drive away hunger and soothe the stomach, particularly useful during Lent when food was restricted. He writes of horehound's power against fever. He writes of wormwood bitter but effective against intestinal distress. He writes about the difficulty of growing some plants in the northern climate, the strategies he uses to protect them through winter, the satisfaction of a successful harvest. And alongside the medical descriptions, he writes about the garden itself as a spiritual space, the act of tending plants, of watching growth of understanding that a seed becomes a remedy, becomes a healing. This was for Walafrid inseparable from the divine order he spent his days praising in the church. That is the essence of what monastic medicine was at its best, not a clinical enterprise separate from faith, and not a faith enterprise indifferent to the body's actual needs. It was both held together, practiced by men who genuinely could not distinguish between worshipping God and caring for the person in front of them who was suffering. The garden smelled of mint and sage in summer. The stone infirmary floor was cold. The patient in the bed had come through the gate without the money to see a physician elsewhere, and a monk with ink-stained hands and a prayer half-formed on his lips was making a poultice with complete sincerity about both activities. Here is what I want you to hold from this chapter as we move forward. The monastery's wealth, that paradox we identified at the end of the last part, the poor monks and the rich institution, made the infirmary possible. Without the accumulated resources of centuries of donated land and produce and money, there was no physic garden, no physician's house, no dedicated bloodletting room with 4 corner fireplaces to keep weakened patients warm, no herb collection that included plants which had been traded from distant monasteries, transported across mountain passes in monks' satchels, cultivated in climates they were never meant to grow in because someone believed they were worth the effort. The very accumulation of power and wealth that would produce the abbot keeping a mistress and the peasants' revolt over millstones, and the commissioners arriving with pre-written deeds of surrender. That same accumulation built the only healthcare institution most of medieval Europe ever had access to. I find this genuinely difficult to hold in my mind simultaneously. The institution was capable of both. It kept producing both. The hands that wrote fraudulent miracle records and the hands that mixed effective remedies from genuine medical knowledge were sometimes the same hands. And the monastery's relationship with power, the thing that made possible both the infirmary and the corruption, is exactly what brings us to the most uncomfortable chapter we have yet to enter. Because what we've seen so far is the institution working, however imperfectly, more or less as intended. What comes next is what happened when the intention itself began to fail. When the men at the top of the hierarchy were no longer serving the life Benedict had designed, but were using it instead to serve themselves. Something has been nagging at me throughout this entire journey, a question I keep circling back to, and I think it deserves a direct answer. We have talked about the bells, the rule, the children handed through monastery gates as infants, the cold rooms and the quill pens and the loopholes engineered around a sacred diet. We have talked about an institution that accumulated land and power on a scale that dwarfed medieval kingdoms, and through all of it, the monks themselves, the ordinary brothers rising at 2 a.m, chanting in the dark, bending their bodies over manuscripts until their hands ached, have come across as genuinely human. Flawed creative suffering, sometimes absurd, but fundamentally sincere. So here is the question. What happened when the sincerity ran out? What happened when the person at the top of that hierarchy, the man with absolute authority over every monk's daily existence, the man who could discipline, punish, expel, or elevate, was not sincere at all, because that happened, more than occasionally. And the story of how it happened and what it looked like and what it cost the people caught inside it is one that gets surprisingly little airtime in the popular imagination of medieval monastery life. Let us start with the abbot, because everything in a monastery started with the abbot. The word itself comes from the Aramaic Abba, meaning father, and the rule of Saint Benedict was explicit about what that role demanded. The abbot was to be a shepherd, not a tyrant. He was to adapt his leadership to each monk's particular character. He was to consult the senior monks before making major decisions, and even the rule noted consult the youngest monks on occasion, because wisdom does not respect rank. He was to lead by example rather than by fear, and he was to remember always that he would answer to God for every soul in his care. A beautiful vision, and real in many cases, genuinely historically real. The great abbots of the medieval period were figures of extraordinary influence and integrity. Bernard of Clairvaux, Hugh of Cluny, Anselm of Bec, these men were revered not because of their institutional power, but because of the palpable quality of their character. When Anselm became Abbot of Bec in Normandy in the year 1078, he reportedly wept, considering himself unworthy. When he was later made Archbishop of Canterbury against his will, and clashed repeatedly with King William Rufus, he went into exile twice rather than compromise what he believed was right. These were real men of principle operating inside deeply imperfect institutions. But here is the thing about absolute authority: it reliably produces over centuries and across cultures a percentage of people who misuse it. And the medieval monastery structured around obedience so deep that the rule itself compared it to the obedience of death was no exception. The most structurally dangerous corruption in medieval ecclesiastical life was something called simony. The word comes from a man in the New Testament named Simon Magus, who after witnessing the Apostle Peter perform miracles offered money to buy the same spiritual power. Peter's response was essentially, "How dare you?" From that story came the name for one of the most persistent problems in medieval Christendom, the buying and selling of church offices. The practice was not subtle. For a wealthy family who wanted their son installed as abbot of a prosperous monastery, which carried with it control of vast estates, income from multiple manors, a seat of real political influence, the transaction was often as direct as it sounds. Money or land changed hands, the appointment was made, and the monastery's spiritual life was now in the hands of someone who had paid for the position rather than earned it. From an occasional scandal, simony became by the 9th and 10th centuries simply the way the system worked across much of Europe. Secular lords who controlled the land on which monasteries stood regarded the appointment of abbots as essentially their prerogative and a profitable one. Abbots in turn often paid back the investment by directing monastery income toward their patrons. The investiture controversy, the enormous conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV that nearly tore Europe apart in the 1070s and 1080s, was fundamentally a fight over this exact question: who had the right to appoint abbots and bishops? Could a secular king hand a man a bishop's staff, or did that authority belong exclusively to the Church? Gregory VII, the most formidable pope of the 11th century, said no, absolutely not, and issued a document known as the Dictatus Papae in the year 1075, asserting, among other things, that the Pope alone could depose emperors, that no church council could be called without papal approval, and that the Roman Church had never erred and never would. Henry IV responded by declaring Gregory deposed as Pope. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. The crisis reached its most extraordinary moment in January of 1077 in the mountains of northern Italy. Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful secular ruler in Western Europe, stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa for 3 days in the cold of winter, waiting for the Pope to lift his excommunication. He wore the rough clothes of a penitent. He had walked the Alpine passes in winter. He waited in the courtyard like a supplicant. Gregory political calculation running alongside genuine piety eventually received him and lifted the excommunication. The power dynamic of European civilization had been dramatically and visibly rearranged. And underneath all the grand geopolitics, the fundamental issue was still the same one that played out in every monastery across the continent who was in charge. And what did that person do with their power? The answer in too many cases was not what they should have. In the year 1500 and 1916 years before the famous dissolution of the monasteries, Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister, undertook a preliminary investigation of certain religious houses in England. What he found at Peterborough Abbey was direct enough. The abbot had been keeping a mistress. He'd been selling monastery goods for personal profit. Wolsey shut the house down and redirected the funds to found a college at Oxford. That particular story has a tidy ending, relatively speaking. But the broader picture that investigations repeatedly revealed was less tidy. Abbots who hunted, abbots who entertained lavishly with monastery income, abbots who lived in their own separate houses away from their monks, following none of the communal practices the rule prescribed. 30 of the senior abbots of England held seats in the House of Lords, a political honour that placed them among the greatest secular magnates in the kingdom, and the lifestyle that accompanied that position was rarely indistinguishable from those magnates. Hunting, hawking, expensive food and wine, an entourage of servants, the occasional suspicious relationship with a woman in the vicinity. One thing I want to be careful about here, because the history gets politically contested. When Henry VIII's agents conducted their famous survey of English monasteries, beginning in 1535, the reports they produced were gathered with an agenda. Cromwell needed evidence to justify dissolution, and his agents travelling the country with prepared questionnaires known to be working for a king who'd already decided what he wanted were not disinterested researchers. Accusations of prostitution, drunkenness, and various other offences appear in the survey reports, and while some were undoubtedly real, others were almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated to strengthen the political case. But here is what I find telling: many of the complaints in those reports had been made before, by internal church reformers, by bishops writing to abbots in private correspondence, by monks themselves appealing to their order's authorities for relief from abbots who ruled tyrannically. The dissolution reports did not invent the problems, they weaponized them. And what did monastic corruption look like from the inside, from the perspective of the ordinary monk who was not the abbot, not the prior, not the person with power, but simply the person who woke up every morning and had to live under whatever regime chance or circumstance had placed over him? The rule gave monks one significant protection. The abbot was supposed to be elected by the senior monks from among themselves. In practice, this election was often overridden by outside pressure from the patron, who had donated the land from the bishop, from the king, from the pope. A monk who had spent 20 years in a community might find himself suddenly governed by a stranger from a powerful family who had never taken monastic vows seriously and had no particular interest in starting now. There was technically a mechanism for removing an abbot who was scandalously bad and appealed to the Pope. In practice, this was slow, expensive, politically complicated, and frequently ineffective. A monk who complained too loudly could be punished within the monastery long before any external authority intervened. The rule prescribed various forms of discipline for monks who violated the community's norms: exclusion from communal meals, exclusion from prayer, physical correction in more serious cases. All of these were administered by or at the discretion of the abbot. Complaining about the abbot therefore required a particular kind of courage. Some monks had it. There are documented cases throughout the medieval period of communities that collectively refused to accept an imposed abbot, or that appealed successfully to higher ecclesiastical authorities for relief from a tyrannical superior. The records of papal responses to such appeals exist, thin threads of evidence showing that the ordinary mechanism of accountability occasionally worked, but far more commonly the history suggests monks simply endured. The vow of stability, the commitment to remain in one monastery for life, meant there was no exit. The vow of obedience meant that resistance was theologically as well as practically dangerous. And the social reality of the monastery meant that a monk who fell from the abbot's favour could find his daily existence made considerably harder in ways that left no external record at all. I want to pause here and tell you about a man named Richard Whiting. He was the last abbot of Glastonbury, England's oldest and most venerable monastery, a house whose foundation legend claimed it had been established by Joseph of Arimathea himself, who'd brought with him the cup of the Last Supper. Whether you believe that legend or not, the reality of Glastonbury was extraordinary enough on its own terms. By the time Richard Whiting became abbot in the year 1525, it was the richest monastic house in England. Its estate stretched across Somerset. Its church contained some of the most significant relics in the English-speaking world, including what was claimed to be the tomb of King Arthur, excavated with convenient timing after a fire in the 12th century. Pilgrims travelled from across the country to pray there. When Henry VIII's commissioners arrived in 1539 to demand the surrender of Glastonbury, Whiting refused. He was 80 years old. He had been abbot for 14 years. He had, by the accounts of his own monks and his own community, governed with genuine integrity. There is no credible historical record of corruption at Glastonbury under Whiting's leadership. He was arrested. A letter from Thomas Cromwell to Henry VIII survives from this period, and it contains a line of remarkable administrative coldness. Cromwell wrote that he had ensured the abbot would be tried and executed. Note the tense. The trial had not yet happened when Cromwell wrote those words. The outcome had already been decided. Richard Whiting was convicted of treason. The charge in the broadest terms was that he had opposed the royal supremacy, and on November 15th, 1539, he was drawn through the streets of Glastonbury on a hurdle taken to the summit of Glastonbury Tor and hanged alongside two of his monks. He was in his 80s. He had done nothing that any previous generation would have recognised as a crime. His head was placed over the gate of his abbey. I find that story almost unbearable to think about. Not because it is the most extreme example of injustice in medieval history, it is not by a long distance, but because of the specific quality of its cruelty. An old man who had spent his life in sincere service, killed not for what he had done but for what he represented. The last obstacle in the path of an institutional annihilation that had been decided in advance. The dissolution itself deserves its full chapter, and that is coming. But for now I want to sit with the larger truth that this particular chapter of the story reveals. Power within the monastery, like power everywhere, was capable of being exercised with wisdom and genuine care, or with self-interest and cruelty, or with everything in between. The institution provided a framework. The framework shaped behaviour, but it did not determine it. The abbot who was also a saint and the abbot who kept a mistress and sold monastery assets for personal gain lived under the same rule, slept in the same kind of building, wore the same kind of robes. What distinguished them was not the institution they served. It was who they were, and that, I think, is the most honest and uncomfortable thing this whole story keeps returning to. Not that monasteries were corrupt or that they were holy, but that they were human. Fully irreducibly, sometimes nobly and sometimes shabbily human, capable of producing Richard Whiting and Cardinal Wolsey and the Abbot of Peterborough, all at the same time in the same country under the same church. There is one more dimension of life inside those walls that we have barely touched, perhaps the most intimate one. Because every monastery contained alongside its chapel and its scriptorum and its abbot's house, a room where the human story inside those walls reached its most personal, most unavoidable conclusion. The infirmary. the room set aside for the sick and the dying. And what happened there, the medicine, the faith, the remarkable skill and the equally remarkable superstition, the moment when centuries of accumulated knowledge met the absolute limits of what any human hand could do, is where we are going next. Walk with me for a moment into a part of the monastery that most visitors, even in the medieval period, rarely saw. Not the church, not the cloister garden with its quiet colonnades, not the great hall where abbots received dignitaries over wine from Gascony. I want to take you to the quieter, more serious building, the one positioned almost always close to the kitchen, for warmth adjacent to its own small garden and accessible through a door that the healthy members of the community passed, with the kind of careful attention people give to thresholds they are not yet ready to cross. The infirmary. The word comes from the Latin infirmus, not strong, and in the medieval monastery this room sometimes a single chamber, sometimes in larger houses a complex of connected buildings with its own chapel, its own baths, its own small pharmacy was where the boundary between the living world and whatever came next was thinner than anywhere else. It was where monks went when they could no longer keep the rule, where they were permitted at last to eat meat, to sleep later, to speak without the constraints of silence, to be cared for fully and without condition, and it was where, when the time came, they died. Let's start with the medicine because it deserves more serious attention than it usually gets. The popular image of medieval healthcare tends toward the comic or the horrifying. Leeches, bloodletting. 4 humours wildly out of balance while a monk in a robe recites prayers over a feverish patient. There is truth in parts of that image, I will not pretend otherwise, but it is considerably less than the whole truth. The rule of St. Benedict itself instructed that care of the sick should come before and above every other duty. That was not a passive instruction. In the 9th century, when the monastery of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland was designed and built, the architectural plan, a rare surviving document that gives us one of the most detailed pictures we have of how an ideal Benedictine monastery was organized, shows the infirmary as a carefully integrated complex. There was a house for the physician. Directly adjacent to it, a house specifically for bloodletting. Next to that, a medicinal herb garden planned to contain 16 different medicinal plants, positioned between the infirmary and the kitchen, so that remedies could be prepared quickly and delivered while still warm. This was not improvised. This was institutional healthcare planned with the same methodical care that the rest of the monastery's architecture reflected. The monks who served as infirmarians were not formally trained physicians in the modern sense. The great medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier were not yet established when the earlier monasteries were built. But they were, by the standards of their era, exceptionally well-read practitioners. They had access to the Latin translations of ancient Greek medical texts, Hippocrates and Galen most importantly, and they copied, organized and expanded herbal encyclopedias over generations, adding plants that were locally useful, deleting remedies that failed, annotating margins with practical notes from accumulated experience. The Sion Abbey. Herbal compiled in England around the year 1517 listed more than 700 herbal plants and roughly half as many distinct remedies. That is a sophisticated pharmacopoeia by any era's standards. The herbs themselves were planted with genuine practical knowledge. Peppermint for digestion, chamomile for inflammation and pain, lavender for calming the nerves and treating wounds, sage, and here I want to pause because this is remarkable sage, which contains compounds that modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed have real effects on memory and cognition. GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, actually funded a research partnership with a university in Würzburg, Germany, specifically to investigate whether medieval monastic herbal remedies contained compounds that could inform modern drug development? The answer in multiple documented cases was yes. Archaeological excavations at the site of St. Mary's Spital in London, a hospital run by Augustinian canons, found jars in the pharmacy residue containing hemp, opium, poppy, rose cedar and pine. Hemp and opium poppy were and remain genuine sources of pain relief. The monks were not fools with jars of smelly water. They were administering with varying degrees of precision and consistency substances with real physiological effects. At the same time, I want to be honest about what they got profoundly wrong because the history deserves its full dimensions. The theory that governed virtually all medieval medical thinking was the theory of the four humours, the idea inherited from ancient Greek medicine, and most fully articulated by Galen, that the human body contained four essential fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and that illness resulted from these fluids falling out of balance. Restore the balance, restore the health. This led with apparently iron logic to the practice of bloodletting. If a patient had too much blood, which was the explanation offered for fevers, for flush skin, for general excess of energy, you removed some. With leeches or by cutting a vein and letting it drain into a bowl. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 eventually prohibited clergy from performing surgical procedures involving bloodshed, but before and after that prohibition, the practice continued in and around monasteries throughout medieval Europe. It almost certainly killed people. The medieval patients who survived their encounters with the infirmary did so largely because of the herbal remedies, the rest the warmth and the attentive care, not because of the bleeding. The archaeological evidence from monastery sites frequently shows skeletal damage consistent with chronic conditions made worse, not better by the treatments applied. And yet, and this is the complexity I keep returning to, the care itself was real. The attention was real. The Cistercian constitutions, for instance, required that when a monk was ill, the prior came personally to his bedside. The whole community processed to the infirmary with candles and incense and oil for anointing. They sang antiphons and psalms around the sick man's bed. They arranged shifts so that at least one brother remained at his side at all times. They said prayers for him at every daily mass. A patient in a medieval monastic infirmary was by the standards of their time extraordinarily well attended, not merely medically but humanly. No one died alone in that room if the community could help it. Here is something that I find genuinely beautiful and deeply strange in equal measure, and it speaks directly to the heart of what the monastic relationship with death actually looked like. Cistercian novices in their very first weeks in the monastery were given an instruction that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Each night before they fell asleep, they were told to think about two things, the burial of Christ and their own. They were to look at their bed and consciously, deliberately compare it to a grave, to lie down in it as though it were the last time, every night. This was not considered morbid. It was considered preparation the most essential kind. The Latin phrase memento mori, remember that you will die, was not merely a motto on a wall or a skull on a desk in a painting. It was a daily cognitive exercise practiced with as much diligence as the canonical hours. Some houses kept physical reminders. There are records of a monastery in Switzerland that kept a white wooden cross and a skull in the centre of the dining hall. A Trappist house in France had the Latin phrase Hodie mihi cras tibi, written above the door to the cemetery. Today it is I. Tomorrow it will be you. Before you wince at that, and I understand if you do consider what it was for, these men lived in a community where death was not hypothetical, where the person who had sat beside you at Lord's for 20 years would one day not be there, where you would one day not be there yourself, and everyone in the room knew it. The monastic relationship with death was not denial. It was radical acceptance worked at daily until dying was something you had rehearsed enough times in your mind that it no longer needed to be a catastrophe when it arrived. Whether that worked individually and psychologically varied from person to person, but as a cultural project, as a systematic attempt to strip death of its power to terrorize it, was serious and considered and anything but passive. The actual process of dying inside a medieval monastery was governed by rituals of extraordinary precision and care documented in monastic customaries, essentially the procedural handbooks of each religious house. When a Cistercian monk showed signs of approaching death, the infirmary, the monk in charge of the infirmary, made a judgment call, and when that judgment was made, a specific bell sequence rang out across the monastery. 4 rings of the bell followed by the wooden clapper being struck twice as fast as normal. Every monk who heard it wherever he was in the fields in the scriptorum in the cloister knew what it meant. He set down whatever he was doing and came. The dying monk was moved in many traditions from his bed to the floor, specifically to sackcloth laid on a cross of ashes, a gesture of deliberate humility and penitence, returning the body to the earth symbolically before it had literally gone there. His community gathered around him. The prior came with oil for anointing incense, the communion host, a cross and candles. The monks sang. Not in grief. Grief as an ostentatious display was actually discouraged in the monastic tradition, considered an excess of attachment to the world. They sang in hope. The words of the Gospels, "Lord, come down to heal my servant," the words of absolution. The credo said 3 times, and then when the moment came, when the breath stopped, when the soul migrated, as the texts describe it, one monk began to sing alone, "Hurry, saints of God, make haste, angels of the Lord, who are taking his soul and offering it in the sight of the Most High." The community joined together. "May Christ, who called you now, take you and place you in the bosom of Abraham." And then cymbals rang, a single clear note marking the end. I have read many descriptions of death in historical literature. I have not read many that strike me as more fully human than that one. The singing community around a man's deathbed. The words of hope said together. The ritual that acknowledged the moment of passing rather than flinching from it. What happened next was simpler. The body was washed, arranged with hands clasped in prayer as though continuing in death the posture that had defined the monk's waking life. Dressed in his monastic robes, laid in the church surrounded by candles while the community kept vigil through the night in shifts chanting psalms. And then after the morning mass he was buried. The burial itself was in keeping with the general Cistercian and Benedictine emphasis on poverty almost stark. Many traditions required the body to be placed in the ground without a coffin, without a shroud in some houses. The infirmary himself would often climb down into the grave to arrange the body properly. The grave was dug in the monastery's own ground always. Monks were buried where they had lived and prayed. Their cemetery was typically also their orchard, so that the dead lay at the roots of apple trees and in the company of beds of lilies planted for the Virgin Mary's feast days. It is an image I find surprisingly consoling, the dead among the growing things still within earshot, if the dead can hear of the bells that had organized every hour of their living. The grave was usually unmarked. No monument, no inscription for the ordinary monk. A practice entirely consistent with the vow of humility, though it produces centuries later a peculiar effect. Entire communities of people whose names we've largely lost, whose individual stories we cannot reconstruct, who have dissolved back into the earth they were told to think of from their very first nights in the novitiate. One detail that I find particularly moving: monks did not write wills. Having already surrendered all personal property on entering the monastery, there was nothing to leave. Their only possessions were their robes, their shoes, and perhaps a few small tools, a knife for sharpening pens, a needle for mending cloth. These were distributed to the living community after death. not as charity, as practical necessities passed from one pair of hands to the next, carrying the trace of the person who had used them before. There is something in that which touches me in a way I find hard to articulate precisely. The knife that sharpened Brother Thomas's quill for 30 years now in Brother William's hand, the shoes worn smooth by 10,000 steps between dormitory and church now carrying someone else to the same places, continuity without sentiment, community without accumulation, the dead made useful to the living one last time. And one more thing, because this is the detail that has stayed with me longest and sits at the centre of what I find most strange and most real about the monastic relationship with mortality. The dying monk received the last rites only once. That was the rule. The anointing and final absolution were administered at the moment of approaching death, not as a precaution but as the real thing. They constituted, in the theological and legal understanding of the time, something very close to a formal declaration, a kind of institutional death preceding the physical one, and the consequence of that was genuinely remarkable. If the monk received last rites and then unexpectedly, against all medical expectation, recovered, he had a problem. He had already died in the sacramental sense. He had to do penance for having survived. The records contain actual cases of monks who recovered after receiving last rites, and then spent subsequent months performing specific acts of penance for the offence of continuing to breathe. I don't know whether to find that funny or bewildering or sad. I think it is all three simultaneously. It captures in miniature the genuine philosophical seriousness with which the medieval monastery treated the line between this world and the next. They were not playing, they were not performing. They meant every word of every ritual so completely that when the ritual's outcome failed to align with biological reality, the solution was to ask reality to yield not the ritual. There is a question here that I want to sit with together for just a moment because it connects everything we have covered tonight. We live in an era that does almost everything it can to avoid the experience of death. We have outsourced it to hospitals and hospices. We have developed elaborate social customs for not mentioning it directly. We describe the dead as having passed, gone, left us, as though they simply stepped out for a moment and might be back. The average person in the 21st century in the developed world may reach middle age having never witnessed a death directly. The monks who lived inside those stone walls spent their entire adult lives doing the opposite. They thought about death every night before sleeping. They buried their brothers with their own hands in their own orchards. They sang at the bedsides of the dying. They rang specific bells whose sound everyone in earshot knew meant that someone was going. I am not suggesting their way was better. I'm suggesting it was different in a way that reveals something about what we've traded for our particular version of comfort. The medieval monk was no braver than the rest of us, no less frightened of pain or loss. But he'd been given, or had chosen, or had been compelled to accept a framework for thinking about the end that made it visible rather than hidden, present rather than deferred, woven into the daily fabric of ordinary life rather than quarantined behind clinical white walls. There is a building in the Czech Republic in the town of Kutna Hora that was once a Cistercian monastery. The plague of the 14th century killed so many people in the surrounding region that their bones exhumed when the cemetery ran out of space were eventually used to decorate the interior of a small chapel. 40,000 people are estimated to be represented there, their bones arranged into chandeliers and columns and garlands around the walls. Above the entrance door an inscription reads, "I once was what you are, you will be what I am." It is by any modern aesthetic standard an extraordinarily unsettling room. It was not built to unsettle, it was built to remind. Hodi mihi kras tibi. Today it is I, tomorrow it will be you, not as a threat. as an invitation to be present fully and with attention in the brief and irreversible and quite extraordinary time that you have. Which brings us at last to the final chapter of this story. Because for all the bells and the cold rooms and the fat abbots and the dying in orchards, what the monastery left behind in the world was not any of those things. It was something far more durable, something that reaches into your life today right now in this moment, even if you have never once set foot inside a stone cloister or heard a church bell ring before dawn. That legacy is where we are going, and it is bigger than you think. You are still here. And I want to acknowledge that genuinely because we've travelled a long distance together tonight. We started with a bell ringing in the dark at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we've walked through 15 centuries of human ambition and failure and sincerity and contradiction, and cold stone rooms and extraordinary tenderness. We've met children handed to monasteries before they were old enough to choose, monks who classified beavers as fish, scribes who cursed at their pens in the margins of texts that survived 1,000 years, an 80-year-old abbot executed on a hilltop for refusing to surrender a building he loved. And now we have arrived at the final question, the one that makes all the rest of it matter beyond its own time. What did they actually leave us? Let me tell you something that I think will stop you cold the same way it stopped me the first time I really understood it. Right now, tonight, wherever you are, if you're watching this on any kind of screen, if you received any kind of formal education, if you have ever walked into a hospital and received care without being turned away because you could not pay, if you've ever drunk a glass of beer or wine made by a producer who understood fermentation, you are in ways both direct and indirect living in a world shaped by what happened inside those monastery walls. That is not metaphor. That is historical cause and effect traceable in documented chains of transmission. And the full weight of it did not become completely clear to me until I started looking at what actually disappeared and what actually survived when Henry VIII's commissioners began knocking on monastery gates in 1536. Start with knowledge, specifically with what happened to it. When the English monasteries were dissolved between 1536 and 1540, the libraries went with them, not to another location, not to careful storage. They burned. They were scattered. They were sold off books ripped apart for their parchment covers, illuminated manuscripts dispersed across private collections, the accumulated written output of 8 centuries treated as salvageable material rather than irreplaceable record. John Leland, an antiquary working for Henry VIII, who had been tasked with cataloguing monastic libraries before the dissolution watched the destruction with documented despair. He wrote that he saw books suffering the spoilings of those that had more savouriness in eating and drinking than in the things appertaining to the glory of God. He described visiting libraries and finding shelves, stripped pages scattered on the floor, manuscripts sold to grocers for wrapping paper and to bookbinders for binding material. We do not know exactly what was lost. That is the nature of what was lost. The absence cannot be fully measured. What we do know is that the manuscripts which survived did so largely because individual scholars and collectors moved quickly enough to rescue them. Robert Record, the man who invented the equals sign, the mathematical symbol you use every time you write an equation, spent his own money acquiring manuscripts in the years immediately following the dissolution, trying to salvage what he could. Matthew Parker, later Archbishop of Canterbury under Elizabeth I, built one of the most significant private collections of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts in history by gathering what remained. Without those individual efforts of frantic rescue, even more would be gone. What does survive the Lindisfarne Gospels in the British Library, the Codex Amiatinis, at the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana in Florence, the Book of Kells in Dublin, survives as a reminder that what we have is the fraction that cleared the centuries by luck and human stubbornness and the occasional intervention of providence. But the legacy of the monasteries was never only about books. The books were the most visible part. The deeper part was the system they created for producing and transmitting knowledge in the first place. Consider the university. The great medieval universities Bologna founded in 1088, Oxford taking shape through the 12th century, Paris formalised in 1200, Cambridge emerging from Oxford in 1209 after a dispute between scholars and townspeople. These institutions did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from the cathedral school and monastic school tradition that had been developing for centuries beforehand. Monasteries had been running schools primarily for oblates and novices, but often extending to the children of wealthy families in the surrounding area since the 6th century. The only people in medieval Europe who reliably knew how to read and write New Latin had access to texts, and the skills to interpret them were monks. When the intellectual energy of the 12th century Renaissance, the great flowering of philosophy, theology, and natural inquiry that preceded the Black Death needed institutional homes, those homes were built by and for people who had learned their foundational skills in monastery schools. The very idea of a place dedicated entirely to learning, where people gathered not to produce food or run a business or serve a lord, but purely to think and argue and write, is a monastic invention. Transferred over time to secular hands, democratized slowly and imperfectly across the following centuries. But originating there in the cloister, in the long hours between prayer services when a monk with a restless intelligence had nothing to do but read. Now the hospital. The Hôtel Dieu in Lyons, founded in 542. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in 652. St. Bartholomew's in London, founded in 1123, and still operating today, making it one of the oldest hospitals in the world that has remained continuously in service. All of them founded by religious orders, all of them operating on the principle that care of the sick was a sacred obligation that could not be means-tested. Before the monastery infirmaries, there was no institutional framework for the treatment of disease in Western Europe. You had your family if you were lucky. You had local herbalists and wise women if you were fortunate enough to live near one. You had nothing if you were a traveller far from home, or a poor person in a city, or someone whose illness had gone on long enough to exhaust the patience of everyone around them. The monastery changed that. Not perfectly, the treatments, as we have discussed, were a mixture of genuine pharmaceutical knowledge and serious error. But the framework, the idea that an institution should exist for the specific purpose of caring for sick strangers without demanding payment, that is monastic in origin. Every time a person without resources receives medical treatment, because a system exists that obliges care regardless of wealth, they are in a direct historical lineage, the beneficiary of something Benedict wrote in the 6th century. Care of the sick should come before and above every other duty. Let me tell you something that might genuinely surprise you. The beer you drank, the wine in the glass on your table, the cheese that came with it. If any of those things are produced by a European producer with a long tradition, there is a reasonable chance that the techniques underlying their production were developed or significantly refined in a medieval monastery. Cistercian monks were among the most innovative agricultural workers of the 12th and 13th centuries. Settled deliberately in wild and remote places, the deliberate rejection of comfortable locations was part of their reform program. They drained marshes, cleared forests, terraced hillsides, and developed sophisticated water management systems to turn inhospitable land productive. They introduced crop rotation techniques. They developed advanced brewing practices. In Germany and Belgium especially, monastery beer-making traditions became so refined and so prestigious that when the industrial brewing industry developed in the 19th century, it looked directly to monastic recipes and processes as its technical foundation. The great Belgian Trappist breweries Westvleteren, Chimay, Orval Rochefort are still operating today, still producing beer, according to versions of traditions that stretch back centuries still under the stewardship of small communities of monks who rise before dawn to pray and spend the rest of their day at work. The wines of Burgundy, some of the most celebrated and expensive wines produced anywhere on earth, owe their reputation in significant part to Cistercian monks, who spent the 12th and 13th centuries systematically studying the relationship between soil composition, drainage slope angle, and grape variety in ways that were genuinely empirical by the standards of their time. They mapped the terroir of Burgundy with a methodical patience that was in its own way scientific. The concept of the cloer-walled vineyard defining a specific carefully characterized plot of land is a direct inheritance from Cistercian winemaking practice. When you open a bottle of Burgundy today, and the label notes the specific vineyard, the specific slope, the specific microclimate you are reading, the descendant of a document that a monk created 9 centuries ago, while trying to understand why one section of hillside produced wine that tasted different from the section 50 meters away. And then there is the most personal legacy of all, the one that lives in the language you're hearing right now. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century Latin, the common language of administration, law, scholarship, and communication across the empire began to fragment. Regional dialects diverged. The educated class that had maintained classical Latin either died out or retreated. The administrative machinery that had required a common written language disintegrated. Without the monasteries, Latin would likely have become a dead language within 2 or 3 generations of the fall of Rome. Instead, it survived as the common intellectual language of Western Europe for 1,000 years, not because anyone was particularly sentimental about ancient Rome, but because the monasteries needed it. The liturgy was in Latin. The Bible was in Latin. The rule was written in Latin. Every text the monks copied was in Latin. And so the monks taught Latin, learned Latin, preserved Latin, and kept the written tradition alive through the centuries, when there was almost nothing else capable of doing so. The consequences of that survival are almost impossible to fully enumerate. The legal systems of most Western European countries have their conceptual foundations in Roman law, transmitted through Latin texts preserved in monastic libraries. The theological vocabulary that underlies most Western religious thought, whether or not you are religious yourself, comes from Latin texts copied in cold rooms by monks whose hands ached. The root systems of English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian that make those languages partially mutually intelligible trace their Latin core through the same chain of transmission. The word university is Latin. The word hospital is Latin. The word library is Latin. The word school is Latin. Every single one of them carries the trace of a room somewhere in Europe, cold, quiet, lit by the light of narrow windows, where a monk sat down with a quill and decided that this particular text was worth the effort of copying. I want to step back for one final moment and ask a question that I have been building toward all night. What does any of this mean for us now, in this moment? I don't think the answer is, we should live like medieval monks. I have been at pains throughout this story to be honest about the things that were hard and strange and sometimes dark inside those walls. The children who had no choice, the abbot who kept a mistress and sold the grain, the monk bent double over a writing desk until his kidneys hurt, the woman who could not leave to see her dying mother. None of that deserves nostalgia. But here is what I think is true, and what I keep coming back to sitting with this material across many months. Those monks were trying to solve a problem that is not actually different from the problem we face today. The problem of how to make a life that matters, how to structure time so that it does not simply evaporate, how to belong to something larger than your own desires and anxieties, how to face the end your own end which is coming in some morning or evening that you cannot see yet, with enough equanimity to keep living fully in the meantime. They tried to solve it through prayer and labour, through the bell that organised every hour, through community so close that the man beside you at matins was your brother in every meaningful sense of the word, through the daily practice of comparing your bed to a grave. They did not fully succeed. No human institution fully succeeds at anything. But the attempt was serious, the commitment was real, and the things they produced while making it, the books, the universities, the hospitals, the beer, the language, the architecture, the agriculture, the very concept of structured time. These are not incidental byproducts. They are the residue of lives lived with intention. And here is what I find most extraordinary of all the thought that I want to leave you with tonight. The monasteries are gone now, most of them. Dissolved or dissolved. Converted to country houses or hotels or art galleries or conference centres, ruined and romantic in the English countryside, partially standing mostly rubble in what was once called Burgundy, a fragment of Cluny 1/10 of what it was in a small French town where horses now graze in the nave of what was once the largest church in Christendom. But every time you sit down to read, every time you walk into a hospital and expect to be treated, every time you open a book and hold in your hands the physical consequence of the idea that knowledge should be gathered, organized and passed forward, you are holding something that passed through those hands first. The monk who spent a decade illuminating the Lindisfarne Gospels on a windswept island in the North Sea had no idea you existed. He did not know there would be screens or cities of this size or a world connected by invisible signal, at speeds he could not have imagined. He knew only that the text in front of him was worth his full attention, that the work of his 3 fingers, the whole body labouring, was worth doing as well as he could do it, with every hour that the light lasted. And here you are, still reading what he wrote, still lit at this hour by something that passed through that room. Tonight you know things about the world inside those walls that most people never think about. You know about the bell that organised not just a monastery, but an entire civilization's sense of time. About the man who walked away from Rome and accidentally wrote the operating system of Western Europe. About the children who arrived at monastery gates before they could choose. About the silence that produced its own secret language. About the monks who argued with theological precision and evident enthusiasm that a beaver was a fish. About the room where men sat for 6 hours a day, in cold and semi-darkness, preserving the words of people long dead, so that you tonight could still encounter them. You know about the infirmary, the herb garden, the beer, the apple orchard that was also a cemetery, the singing around a deathbed, the bell that rang 4 times and everyone who heard it knew. You know, I hope something you did not know before you press play, and that more than anything else I can offer is why I do this. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it made the world feel a little larger and a little longer and a little more connected than it did before, please leave a comment below and tell me what part surprised you most. I read every single one and they genuinely shape what I research next. If you are not yet subscribed, this would be a wonderful moment to do it. Not because I will tell you to, but because there are more stories waiting. Stories just as old and just as strange and just as unexpectedly present in the lives we're all living right now, and I would genuinely love for you to be here for them. The next journey we take together will begin in a world not far from this one, but a world where the bells have stopped ringing, where the gates have been forced open, and where everything those monks built over 1,000 years is being dismantled in a single generation. What happened in the years after the monasteries fell is its own extraordinary story of displacement, of remarkable courage, of what ordinary people do when the institutions that have structured their entire reality simply vanish one morning and do not return. But that is for another night. For now let the light stay soft. Let the room be quiet. You've spent a few hours inside walls that most people have forgotten with people who lived entirely differently from you, and yet somehow not so differently at all. They were trying to get it right too. Sleep well, friend. and thank you genuinely and completely for being here tonight.